The ocean stretches from horizon to horizon. No shore, no ship, no birds. Just a red sun of the wrong color and a piece of styrofoam beneath the chest of a drowning man. Dan touches the green panel above his eye with his finger, and the debris around him begins to pull toward him like iron to a magnet. But let's rewind for a second. Daniel Chen surfaces from the black abyss and gasps for air like a fish on deck. He coughs. He spits out salt. His lungs are burning. His skin is burning. The sun is directly overhead, and it's too red, too big. This isn't the sun he remembers. He rolls onto his back. His heart is pounding in his ears. He raises his hand to shield his eyes from the light, and freezes. A translucent panel hangs over his right eye. Green letters stand out against the sky. Arc system, initializing, module available, rescue pontoon. Dan blinks. The panel doesn't go dark. He pinches himself. It hurts. The panel holds. He pokes it with his finger. His finger passes right through. And the debris beneath it shudders, and a rumbling comes from below. Dan looks down and can't believe his eyes. The edge of the styrofoam stretches. A floating bottle twitches and sticks to the raft. Behind it, a bag. Behind that, a piece of a box. The plastic fuses with the styrofoam. The seams disappear. And this is where the strangest part begins. A platform grows beneath him. 1 meter. 2. 3. All the debris in the area is drawn to him like iron to a magnet. 10 minutes later, beneath his knees is no longer a piece of debris, but a smooth 6-meter-long pontoon with sides. The panel flashes. Done. And now imagine this man's situation. He is an engineer. He built offshore platforms. He knows the ocean like the back of his hand. And this ocean is wrong. Too warm. Too quiet, too empty. No seagulls, no dolphins. Dead water stretching to the very edge of the world. He remembers his life. Long Beach, the night shift, the highway along the coast. Darkness. Beyond that, nothing. And now, above his eye, an interface that builds structures out of junk. And he's alone. No water, no food. No shade. Dan thinks of a canopy. The panel immediately sketches a diagram. He looks at the floating plastic and gives a mental command. Yes. The pontoon hums. The plastic soars onto the frame. A shadow falls on his face and his brain finally kicks in. And at that moment, the panel flashes. Object detected. 4 kilometers. Southeast. Watercraft. Emergency status. Dan jumps up. Somewhere out there, someone is drowning. And he has neither oars nor a sail. The panel seems to read his mind. Module available. Rowing unit. 2 oars sprout from the sides of the pontoon. Rough. Heavy. Work oars. Dan rows. His muscles burn after a minute. His palms are raw and bleeding after 5. The sun scorches his back. He rows. The point creeps closer. 3 kilometers. 2. 1.5. And now he sees it. A raft made of barrels and planks. Tilted. Half submerged. 4 figures on it. 2 large. 2 small. Dan pushes forward. A kilometer away he can make out their faces. A man is scooping water with his hands. A woman is holding the children close. The barrels are sinking. They have an hour. Maybe less. Dan pulls the raft right up to them. The man lifts his head. His eyes are red from the salt. His face is that of a man who has already given up hope. Dan reaches out his hand. The man grabs it. His palm is dry and hot as sandpaper. Dan pulls him aboard. Then his wife. Then a boy of about 6. Then a girl of about 4. The girl isn't crying. She looks at Dan with huge dark eyes and says nothing. The woman gasps out a single word. Water. And right then, the engineer's voice breaks. The desalinator in the system is unavailable. The level is too low. Not a drop of fresh water. Nothing but the salty ocean all around. 4 dehydrated people, 0 water, and a skill that's useless right now. Dan clenches his teeth. He looks at the canopy, at the sun, at the plastic in the water, and he smiles. He doesn't need the module. He needs physics. He tears off a piece of plastic with his hands. He shapes a container on the edge of the pontoon. He scoops up seawater. He stretches the plastic over the top. He places a pebble in the center to create a slope. He holds up half a bottle. That's it. The sun will heat the water. The vapor will condense on the plastic. Drops will drip into the bottle. With a solar still made from trash. An hour later, the first sip in the bottle. Dan hands it to the girl. She drinks. She looks at him. And blinks for the first time. The man says his name is Carlos Lopez. His wife is Marta. His son is Ricardo. His daughter is Inez. They are rafters. Their caravan of 20 rafts was scattered by a storm 2 weeks ago. They've been drifting ever since. Carlos asks where Dan is from. Dan is silent for a second. He says he's from far away. Carlos nods. Everyone here is from far away. There's no such thing as near here anymore. And as the sun creeps toward the horizon, Carlos tells his story. The world is flooded. 70 years ago, the glaciers melted into the ocean. The old cities lie at the bottom. People live on rafts and on the tops of skyscrapers that still stick out of the water. 3 kinds of people. Rafters, poor, free, and mortal. Tower dwellers. They sit on the upper floors and trade rainwater. Corporations. Real ships with nuclear reactors. Masters of the sea. Dan listens, and every word falls into place like a detail in a blueprint. A world without land. A world without resources. A world where an engineer with his brain is worth more than a battleship. He looks at the Lopez family. Carlos is falling asleep. Marta is feeding the children drop by drop. Inez is clinging to her mother and won't take her eyes off Dan. He doesn't know who gave him this system. He doesn't know the rules of this world. He knows one thing. Those 4 were dead within an hour. Now they're drinking water on his pontoon. And the panel is flashing again. Object detected, 11 kilometers, northwest, a vessel, large, adrift, no power signal. Dan looks to the northwest. The sun is setting, painting the water black and red. 11 kilometers by oars is out of the question today. But tomorrow... Dan lies on his back. The panel goes dark. The stars are so thick that the sky is white. Not a single light on the horizon. Just stars and water and the splash of waves against the hull. Dan falls asleep. For the first time in this world. For the first time without blueprints and deadlines. For the first time next to people he saved, not on paper, but with his own hands. Dawn comes quickly. The sky turns from black to red in a matter of minutes. Dan opens his eyes, and the first thing he sees is the panel. It's already working. Arc system, status, pontoon level 1, passengers 4 out of 4, resources within detection range, plastic, plenty, metal, traces, biomass, minimal. Object to the northwest. Distance 10 and 8 kilometers. The drift has changed the distance overnight. It's gotten closer. The current is carrying them in one direction. Dan sits down and inspects the pontoon. Martha is no longer asleep. She's sitting by the solar distiller, waiting. There are about 100 milliliters of water left in the bottle at the bottom. Not enough. For 5 people, that's almost nothing. Dan builds 3 more distillers. The plastic is drawn from the water by the system. Molding takes minutes. By mid-morning, they have 4 working units. That will yield about a liter by sunset. 200 milliliters per person. Not enough. But they won't let us die. Carlos wakes up and stares at the new distillers for a long time, then at Dan. He says he hasn't seen anything like this in 20 years on the water. That Dan doesn't look like a raft builder, doesn't look like a tower builder, definitely not a corporation. Dan replies that he's an engineer. Carlos is silent. In this world, the word engineer sounds like the word magician. Ricardo and Inez have woken up. The boy immediately goes to the edge of the pontoon and looks into the water. The girl sits where she is and watches Dan. She doesn't take her eyes off him. Dan checks the panel. A target to the northwest. A large vessel. No power signal. That means it's dead, abandoned or sunk. But if the hull is intact, even partially, that's metal. Tons of metal. And metal is everything. Dan explains to Carlos that they need to get to that object. Carlos asks how. 11 kilometers. Oars. One rower because Carlos is too weak. Dan doesn't answer. He looks at the panel and thinks. Propulsion system level 1 is oars. We need level 2. The panel shows. Propulsion system level 2. Pedal drive with a propeller. Required. Hard plastic, 12 kilograms. Metal, 0.3 kilograms. There's enough plastic, no metal. Dan thinks. He looks around. The debris around him is plastic and wood. There's almost no metal. He remembers the Lopez's raft, half submerged. They abandoned it yesterday. It must be nearby. Dan stands up and scans the water. The raft is drifting 100 meters away. The barrels have almost sunk. But the planks are still holding. And there are nails on the planks. Rusty, bent nails. 300 grams of steel. Dan paddles toward the raft. It takes him 20 minutes. He pulls out every nail, 17 of them. He returns to the pontoon. He activates the module. The pontoon hums. The nails melt and are integrated into the mechanism. A seat forms from the plastic. A propeller extends from beneath the pontoon. Pedals appear. The system is ready. Dan sits down on the seat and starts pedaling. The pontoon moves forward, slowly but steadily, about 4 kilometers per hour. 3 hours to the target. Carlos sits next to the children and watches silently. Marta drinks water from the distiller. Inez doesn't take her eyes off the pedals. 3 hours pass. The sun climbs toward its zenith and the heat becomes unbearable. Dan pedals. His legs are burning. His back is wet. The panel shows the distance. 7, 5, 3, 1. The object appears on the horizon. First a dark streak, then an outline, then details. A dry cargo ship, an old container ship, huge, 150 meters long. It's lying on its side. The port side is almost completely underwater. The starboard side is sticking up. The superstructure is still intact. Rust covers everything. Reddish, black, red. The hull is like the body of a dead whale. Dan pulls the pontoon up alongside the starboard side. The metal hums with heat. He touches the hull with his hand. Warm, rough, alive to the touch because something inside is creaking from the waves. The scanner begins its scan. Data streams in. Hull, steel. Hull plating thickness, 12 millimeters. Corrosion, 35%. Load-bearing structures, bulkheads. 7 out of 12 visible are intact. Engine compartment, completely flooded. Of no interest. Pump compartment, partially flooded. Operational unit detected. Wärtsilä ballast pump. Condition, 62%. Repairable. Starboard hull plating. Section from the 42nd to the 57th bulkhead. Minimal corrosion. Thickness intact. Suitable for removal. Dan stands on the pontoon and reads the data. And for the first time since waking up, he feels at home. This is his language. This is his territory. He knows these pumps. He's worked with these models. Wärtsilä, a Finnish manufacturer, as reliable as an axe. If 62% of this pump is intact, that means only the seals and part of the impeller need replacing. The rest will hold up. And the whole section, pure steel, tons of pure steel. You could build something out of this. Dan stops himself. Don't get carried away. Priorities first. Water, food, shelter, then everything else. He tells Carlos to stay on the pontoon with his family. Carlos nods. Dan scrambles up the rusty side of the dry cargo ship. His hands slip on the metal. The rust digs into his palms. He pulls himself up on the railing and makes his way across the bulwark. The deck is at a 30-degree angle. It's impossible to walk, only to crawl. Dan crawls along the side toward the superstructure. The panel scans every meter. Inside the superstructure, it's dark and hot. The metal walls are scorching hot. The air smells of rust and salt and something Swedish. Dan descends the stairs. The railing holds. The steps creak but don't break. 2 levels down. 3. The water starts on the 4th level. Warm, murky, knee-deep. Dan walks down the flooded corridor. The panel lights the way. The pump room is at the end of the corridor. The door is jammed. Dan braces himself with his shoulder. He pushes. The metal screeches. The door gives way. Inside the pump room, the water is waist deep. A ballast pump hangs on the wall, large, heavy, covered in green slime but intact. Dan walks over and places his hands on the pump housing. The panel displays the internal diagram. Every bolt, every gasket, every micro crack. He reads this pump like a surgeon reads an X-ray. The impeller is 80% intact. The O-rings are rotten. The housing is crack-free. The shaft is straight. The bearings are replaceable. This pump will work. Not as a ballast pump, as the foundation for a reverse osmosis desalinator. To force seawater through a membrane under pressure. The membrane can be made from certain polymers. The pump provides the pressure. Energy comes from the wind or pedals. 500 liters a day of clean, fresh water. Dan starts removing the pump. The system helps. The bolts that are tightly rusted in give way when Dan applies the panel to them. It's not magic. It's directed vibration. Micro-resonance in the molecular structure of the rust. The panel calculates the frequency. Dan touches it with his finger. The rust crumbles. The bolt unscrews. 2 hours later, the pump is lying on the deck. 40 kilograms. Dan looks at it and already sees the finished desalinator in his mind's eye. Then he moves on to the hull plating, the starboard section, 6 meters by 4, 12 millimeters thick, good steel. The system helps cut it, directed vibration along the cut line, slowly, centimeter by centimeter. It takes 4 hours. The sun is already sinking toward the horizon when the sheet of steel finally separates from the hull and crashes into the water. Dan climbs back down to the pontoon. Carlos helps tie the steel sheet to the stern. The pump is secured in the center. The pontoon sags under the weight. The panel flashes yellow. Overload. Upgrade recommended. Pontoon level 2. Required. Plastic 40 kilograms. Steel 10 kilograms. Biomass is 5 kilograms. Dan now has enough steel. He activates the upgrade. The pontoon hums. Part of the steel sheet is consumed. The plastic is pulled out of the water. The platform expands. The sides rise. A keel forms under the hull. 30 minutes later, it's no longer a pontoon. It's a boat. 10 meters long, 4 meters wide, with a keel and sides, with a canopy over half the deck, with space for cargo. The panel updates. Level 1 boat, 5 out of 8 passengers. Carlos stands at the bow of the new boat and touches the side with his hand. The side is smooth, sturdy. Carlos turns to Dan, and something changes in his eyes. Not just gratitude, something like the way a person looks at the first rain after a drought. Marta is crying silently. Ricardo is running around the deck. Inez is sitting in her spot and looking at Dan. She still isn't smiling, but she's no longer clutching her knees to her chest. Night, the second in this world. Dan sits at the stern of the boat and makes plans. Tomorrow he'll start assembling the desalinator. He has a pump. He needs a membrane. He needs a drive. He needs tubes. Some parts can be found on the freighter. Some can be cobbled together from scrap. The panel already displays the blueprint. Every component, every connection, every unit of energy consumption per liter of water. Dan looks at the blueprint and, for the first time in 2 days, thinks about the future for more than an hour. The panel flashes. Object detected. Distance 30 kilometers. Direction southwest. Type structure. Stationary. Status inhabited. Energy signal. Weak. 30 kilometers. The morning of the third day begins with Ricardo's scream. The boy is standing at the bow of the boat, pointing at the water. Dan jumps up and runs over. A body is floating in the water near the side of the boat. Face down, arms outstretched. Old clothes, a woven plastic backpack on his back. Dan leans over the side and grabs the backpack. Heavy. He pulls. The body flips over. A man in his 50s. Dead. Long dead. The skin is swollen and darkened. Martha leads the children to the stern. Dan pulls the backpack out. Inside, a bottle of fresh water, half full. A knife. A real steel knife with a wooden handle. Poorly sharpened, but the steel is good. 3 bone fishing hooks. A coil of braided polyethylene rope. A piece of wax-soaked cloth. Dan lays the items out on the deck. The panel scans each object. Knife. Carbon steel. Weight. 140 grams. That's not much, but to the system, even grams matter. Dan looks at the knife and realizes something about its former owner. The knife is sharpened on the left side. Left-handed. The handle is wrapped with an extra layer of rope at the bottom. His hands were weak, probably arthritis. Bone hooks mean he knew how to fish, but didn't have access to metal. A raft dweller, a loner, an old fisherman who drifted too long without company. The panel shows no emotion. Dan demonstrates it himself. He silently packs up his things. The body is carried away by the current. Carlos takes off his homemade hat and watches it go. He says that on good days, you find things. On bad days, you find people. Dan works all day. He returns to the dry cargo ship 3 times. The first time for the tubes. Copper tubes from the cooling system. The panel had marked them on the diagram yesterday. Corroded, but usable. 4 meters of copper tubing is the basis for a condenser. The second time for filter material. Barrels of activated carbon were found in the dry cargo ship's hold. The cargo this ship carried in its past life. The carbon is wet, but functional. The third time for a piece of rubber, a large gasket from a cargo hatch. The rubber is old, but elastic. We can cut a membrane out of it. Not perfect, not like an industrial reverse osmosis membrane, but sufficient for rough filtration. The pressure from the pump will force the water through the rubber. The salt will be trapped. Most of it, not all of it. The water will be brackish, but drinkable. By evening, there's a contraption on the boat that looks like nothing Carlos and Marta have ever seen. A pump, tubes, a rubber membrane clamped between 2 steel plates, an activated carbon filter, a foot pedal connected to the pump via a braided polyethylene belt. Dan sits down at the pedal and starts pumping. The pump whistles. Air escapes from the system. Then water flows. Muddy. Then clearer. Then clear. Dan fills a glass and tastes it. Salty, but fresh, drinkable. He does the math. 20 minutes of pedaling yields about 3 liters. 15 liters an hour if he doesn't get tired. Realistically, 6 or 7 liters an hour with breaks. 40 to 50 liters a day. For 5 people, that's a luxury. Carlos tastes the water, slowly, a sip at a time. He closes his eyes, and an expression appears on his face that Dan will remember forever. This is what a man looks like who has been drinking only rainwater collected in dirty containers for 2 years and is tasting something clean for the first time. Mar is crying. She cried yesterday too, but today her tears are different. Quiet. Ricardo drinks and laughs. Ines drinks in silence and then sits for a long time with an empty bottle in her hands. Morning of the 4th day. The panel shows a new signal. 2 objects to the east. Distance 5 kilometers. Watercraft. Small. Status active. Moving toward the boat. 2 rafts are heading toward them. Dan reaches for his binoculars. There are no binoculars. He squints. An hour later, the 2 rafts come closer. One person on each. Old men. One large with a white beard. The second thin with long arms. Both in faded shirts and homemade plastic hats. Fishermen. Dan sees their gear. Bamboo fishing rods. Nets made of braided line. Metal hooks. So they had access to metal. So they aren't exactly poor. The old man with the white beard approaches the boat's side and takes a long look at it. Then he looks at Dan. Then at the desalinator. Then back at Dan. He introduces himself. Moon. Just Moon. His partner's name is Juan. They're fishermen, 40 years on the water. They've seen it all, but they've never seen anything like this. Moon asks who built it. Dan replies that he did. Moon asks how. Dan says he's an engineer. Moon is silent. Huang is silent. They exchange glances. Moon says he heard that word from his grandfather. His grandfather worked at the factory before the thaw. He used to say that engineers made things that worked, not like now when everything depends on luck and prayers. Real things that didn't break. Moon points at the desalination plant. He asks, "Is this a real thing?" Dan nods. Moon nods back. Then he asks if they can stay. Dan looks at the panel. 5 out of 8 passengers. With Moon and Juan, it'll be 7 out of 8. 1 spot left. He says yes. Moon and Juan haul their things onto the boat. There isn't much. Fishing rods, nets, a bag of dried fish, a barrel of rainwater, and a small bag with 12 nails that Moon keeps as currency. 12 nails are a fortune for a raftsman. Moon hands them to Dan without a word. He says that nails in the hands of someone who knows how to use them are worth more than in the pocket of someone who trades them. Juan prepares the fish. For the first time in 3 days, there is food on the boat. Real food. Not seaweed and not the plastic taste of distilled water. The dried fish is tough and salty, but it's protein and it's energy. Dan eats and feels his body thanking him for every bite. Carlos and Moon are talking. 2 rafters, different generations. Carlos is younger and angrier. Moon is older and calmer. But both are talking about the same thing. The world is getting worse. The storms are stronger. The fish are going deeper. The rafts are sinking more often. 10 years ago, rafters caravans numbered 100 bundles. Now, 20 is a rarity. In 10 years, there won't be any rafters left. Moon says he's heard about something. A typhoon. A huge one. Bigger than any storm. Meteorologists from the southern towers estimate it will arrive in 3 years. Maybe sooner. They call it Leviathan. Moon says that if Leviathan comes, no one will survive on the water. Not the rafters, not the tower dwellers, maybe not even the corporations will survive. Dan listens. 3 years. Leviathan. He looks at the panel, the Ark system. It's a name he didn't choose. The system gave it to itself. The Ark, a ship that saves from the flood. Coincidence or not, Dan doesn't believe in coincidences. He believes in calculations and data. But so far, there's not much data. Too little. He knows what he can build. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know for whom. He doesn't know what scale is needed. But he has a boat for 7 people, a desalinator, 2 days' worth of food, and the coordinates of an inhabited tower 30 kilometers away. The morning of the 5th day, Dan makes a decision. They're heading for the tower. The pedal drive is slow. 30 kilometers is almost 10 hours. They set out at dawn. Dan and Carlos take turns pedaling. Moon and Juan fish from the deck. Marta watches the children and the desalinator. Time passes. The water around them changes. More debris, then less, then more again. Something vertical appears on the horizon. A thin line. Dan squints. The line grows. It's not a mirage. It's a tower. The top floors of a skyscraper jutting out of the water. 20, maybe 25 stories above the surface. The rest is underwater. The walls are covered with a coating of salt and rust. On the roof are antennas and some kind of structures. Rain collectors. Large, spread-out sheets of plastic and fabric stretched over frames. Water runs down them into reservoirs. That's where the tower dwellers get their fresh water. Dan brings the boat closer. People are visible on the lower accessible floors of the tower, about a dozen. They're standing on balconies and platforms welded to the walls. They're looking at the boat. They aren't waving. They aren't shouting. They're just looking. One of them raises something long. Dan doesn't immediately realize what it is. Then he realizes. A crossbow. Homemade. Made of steel and plastic. Dan stops the boat 100 meters from the tower. Too far for a crossbow. Close enough to talk if he shouts. But Dan doesn't shout. He raises his hands, empty palms, a universal gesture. The man with the crossbow doesn't lower his weapon. Moon stands next to Dan. He shouts, introduces himself, says they're peaceful, that they've come to trade. A pause. The man with the crossbow says something back over his shoulder. Waiting. 5 minutes. 10. Then a new person appears on the balcony. A woman. Short, in dark clothes. Her hair is tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. She leans over the railing and looks at the boat for a long time. Then she shouts. Her voice is low and calm. She asks what they have to offer. Moon answers, fish. The woman says they have fish. Moon looks at Dan. Dan takes a step forward. He says one word. Water. The woman falls silent. On the tower, water is currency. The rain collectors provide a limited amount. Every liter counts. And now a man arrives in a boat and offers water. It's either a joke, or a trap, or something impossible. The woman asks how much. Dan answers, 50 liters a day. Every day. As they stand there, silence on the tower. Even the man with the crossbow lowers his weapon and looks back at the woman. She says, come closer. Dan pulls the boat up to the tower. Moon throws a rope. The man with the crossbow catches it and ties it to the railing. They climb the outside ladder. The rusty steps wobble but hold. The woman meets them on the landing of the third visible floor. Up close, she is older than she seemed, about 40. Her face is weathered. Her hands are rough. Her eyes are alert. She says her name is Nari. She is the senior resident of this tower. 42 people live here. They have fresh water from rain collectors. They have fish. They have pre-war canned food supplies found on the flooded floors below. They have no metal for repairs. The tower is called Spire 7. No one remembers why 7. Nari says that when her grandfather took over this tower, it was already the 7th in the chain. The other 6 drowned or collapsed long ago. Only this one remains, 23 floors above the water. There are 40 more below, but they're flooded and sealed off by watertight bulkheads welded together from car doors. Dan follows Nari down the corridors, his eyes unable to take in everything he sees. The walls are reinforced with steel sheets. The seams are rough. They welded them together with whatever they could find. The floors are covered with wooden pallets laid over concrete. On every floor, people live. Families, lonesomes, old people, children. Small rooms are partitioned off with screens made of fabric and plastic. It smells of salt and fish and smoke from oil lamps. Dan counts the people. Nari said 42. He sees about 30. So the rest are on the lower floors or on duty. On every floor, Dan notices problems. A crack in a load-bearing wall on the 4th level. Corrosion on the rebar on the 6th. A leak in the airtight bulkhead between the 8th and 9th. The wind turbine on the roof spins and jerks. A blade is bent. The bearing is squeaking. The second generator is down. The winding has burned out. The panel scans all this and outputs the data. Dan is silent. Not because he has nothing to say, because if he says everything he sees right away, Nari will think he's trying to scare her. He needs to take it step by step. Nari leads him to the roof. You can see everything from here. The ocean in every direction. Rain collectors. Large canvases stretched between the antennas, tanks beneath them, 3 200-liter barrels, 1 full, 2 half-full. That's a reserve in case there's no rain for a week. It won't last 2 weeks. Nari asks directly, "What can you do?" Dan says he can fix the wind turbine. He can boost the rain collectors so they collect twice as much. He can weld the crack on the 4th tier. He can rewind the 2nd generator's coil if they can find some copper wire. Nari listens. Her face is impassive. She asks what he wants in return. Dan says, metal, as much as they can give, and the right to return. Nari thinks. Then she nods. She leads him down to the storeroom. The storeroom is a room on the 12th level, crammed with stuff. Boxes, barrels, sacks. In the corner is what Dan needs. Pieces of steel, reinforcing bars, pipes, bolts in a rusty bucket. About 200 kilograms of metal in various conditions. For the tower dwellers, this is a strategic reserve. They've been hoarding it for years. They've used it sparingly. Dan looks at the pile of metal and sees 3 ships in it. He tells Nari he'll start with the generator. It's the quickest and most noticeable. If the tower guards see him doing it instead of just talking, they'll believe him faster. Nari agrees. Dan climbs onto the roof and gets to work. The panel displays the generator's schematic. The blade is bent 17 degrees. The bearing is 40% worn. The fasteners have loosened. Dan removes the blade. He straightens it using the edge of the concrete parapet as an anvil. He strikes it with a stone. Precisely, calculatedly. Each blow lands on the panel. The metal yields. The blade straightens out. He doesn't touch the bearing. Instead, he packs a thick mixture of fish oil and plastic dust into the gap, a temporary lubricant. It'll last a month. He tightens the fasteners with a wrench he found in the warehouse. 3 hours later, the generator is running. The blades rotate smoothly, a quiet hum. The wires under the paneling begin to buzz. A light bulb comes on the 15th floor. 1, small, yellow. Dan stands on the roof and can't see what's happening below, but Moon can. Moon will tell him later. The old man on the 15th floor is named Kim. He is 67. He has lived in the tower for 20 years. For the last 10 years, the light on his floor has not been on. He stopped waiting a long time ago. When it lit up, he got up from his spot and walked over to it. He reached out his hand. He touched the glass. Warm, alive, light, real electric light. Not an oil lamp, not a bonfire. Light. Kim stood there, stroking the light bulb with his finger, silently, until he was called to dinner. Dan has been working on the tower for 3 days. He fixed both generators. He sealed a crack on the 4th level, reinforced the rain collectors, rebuilt the drainage system so that not a single drop is wasted. He assembled a shower from scraps of pipe and an old valve, one for the entire tower. Cold, salty because the water is pumped from the ocean, but it's a shower. The first in 10 years for most of the residents. Nari stands nearby as the first woman steps into the stall. The sound of water. Then silence. Then laughter. Real, genuine laughter. Nari turns to Dan. She says he can take as much metal as he can carry. Dan takes 100 kilograms, reinforcing bars, pipes, bolts. He loads them onto the boat. The panel counts. 100 kilograms of steel is serious. It's the foundation for the next upgrade, Arc Level 0. Before leaving, Nari asks when he'll be back. Dan says in 2 weeks. Nari nods. She says that if he needs people on the tower, there are 4 who want to leave. Young, strong. They feel cramped on the tower. Dan says he'll take them when there's room. Nari says she'll wait. The boat pulls away from the tower. 100 kilograms of steel on board. 7 people. 5 days worth of water and fish. The panel updates. A new line appears. Project available. Arc 0. Class schooner. Capacity 30 people. Required 400 kilograms of steel. 200 kilograms of high-density plastic. 50 kilograms of biomass. 100 kilograms of wood, 15 kilograms of copper. Energy, equivalent to 120 hours of pedal power. 400 kilograms of steel. He has 100. He needs another 300. Dan looks out at the ocean. Somewhere, are there still dry cargo ships out there? More towers, more resources. Time. He needs time and people. The boat heads back to the dry cargo ship, their temporary base. Dan spends the next week dismantling the dry cargo ship, methodically, section by section. The panel calculates which parts of the structure can be removed without bringing down the rest. It's like dismantling a house, removing only the cards that aren't holding anything up. Moon and Juan help, Carlos too. His hands are used to hard work. Marta cooks and keeps an eye on the water. The kids are busy. Ricardo helps Juan with fishing. Inez sits next to Dan and watches him work. She still doesn't speak. But she's there. Always there. On the third day of dismantling the dry cargo ship, Dan finds something he didn't expect. Hold number 4. Partially flooded. But the upper part is dry. And there are boxes there. 23 boxes, labeled in Korean. Dan doesn't read Korean, but the panel translates. Solar panels, silicon, pre-war model. 23 boxes, 4 panels each. 92 solar panels. Dan stands in the dim light of the hold and looks at the crates. His hands are shaking. Not from fatigue, from realization. 92 panels. Each produces 300 watts at peak. 27 kilowatts of total power. That's energy. Real energy. Not pedaling, not wind, the sun. Of which there is plenty here. 27 kilowatts is a desalinator that produces not 50, but 500 liters a day. It's a forge. It's a welder. It's light at night. It's everything. Dan returns to the boat and immediately tells Carlos and Moon that they need to unload the hold. They work for 2 days. They haul the boxes one by one through the flooded corridors. It's hard, it's wet, it's dangerous. Once, Carlos slips on the stairs and nearly falls into the flooded lower deck. Moon catches him by the arm. 92 boxes. They pulled out 89. 3 are too deep. The water has risen. We can't reach them. 89 panels. 26 and 7 kilowatts. Enough. Dan lays out the first panels on the boat's deck, connects them to the system. The panel flashes with new data. Power supply activated. Solar generation. Current power output 2.4 kilowatts. 8 panels connected. Modules available with current power. Desalination unit. Level 2. Automatic. Capacity 200 liters per day. Welding module. Level 1. Spot welding. Maximum thickness 3 millimeters. Navigation module. Level 1. Determining coordinates by the sun and stars. Dan activates the desalinator. Level 2. The boat hums. A compact unit is formed from drawn plastic, and steel unit is formed at the stern. A quiet electric hum. The pump pushes water through the membrane. 200 liters per day. Automatically. No pedals. Moon approaches the desalinator and listens to it working. A quiet, steady sound, like a heartbeat. Moon says this sound is the most beautiful of all he has heard in 40 years on the water. By the end of the second week, they have 230 kilograms of steel. They are still short by 170, but Dan already knows where to get it. 3 days to dismantle the remaining sections of the dry cargo ship. Dan works from dawn till dusk. His hands are covered with cuts from the rusty metal. The panel lights up the cut lines. Directed vibration breaks down the rusted seams, but they have to peel off the hull plates by hand. Carlos works nearby, silently. They no longer talk while working. There's no need. Carlos sees where Dan is looking and hands him the tool before Dan even asks. Moon and Juan haul the finished pieces onto the boat. By the end of the third day, they have 420 kilograms of steel. More than they need. A reserve for processing losses. There's enough plastic around. Biomass is algae that grows on any surface within days. Wood. Wood is a problem. The only source is debris from old rafts and furniture that sometimes floats by. In 2 weeks, they've collected about 60 kilograms. They need 100. Dan decides to start construction with what they have. The system allows for phased construction. First, the hull, then the mast, then the interior finish. Wood is needed for the mast and for deck planking. The hull can be made of steel and plastic. Dan chooses a spot, near a dry cargo ship. He ties the boat to the side. He lays out the steel sheets on the water. The panel displays the blueprint, the hull of a schooner, 18 meters long, 5.5 meters wide. Draft, 1 meter 40. Double bottom, 4 watertight compartments. Keel made of rebar. Frames made of bent steel strips. Hull plating made of sheet steel reinforced with a plastic composite. This is not a beautiful ship. It is a working ship, like an industrial trawler, sturdy, stable, not fast, but resilient. Dan activates construction. The boat vibrates. The panel lights up with dozens of indicators. The steel sheets begin to move, slowly, heavily. They bend along the lines drawn by the panel. The rebar melts and fuses into the frame. Power comes from the solar panels. The process is slow, not like with the pontoon, where everything came together in minutes. Steel is heavy. Steel is stubborn. Every seam requires time and energy. The panel shows progress. 1%, 2, 3. Estimated time to complete the hull, 72 hours. 3 days. Dan can't just sit and wait. He monitors every weld, checks every joint. He makes adjustments when he sees the metal is going the wrong way. The system is powerful, but not omnipotent. It works with what it has. And what it has is rusty steel of varying thickness and quality. Every sheet is different. Every weld is unique. This isn't factory assembly. This is handwork using a tool that no one else has. The first day of construction. The hull rises from the water like a whale's skeleton. The frames are hoisted one by one. The steel arches glisten in the sun. Ricardo stands with his mouth agape, watching. Inez sits at the bow of the boat and watches. She still doesn't speak. But for the first time, Dan notices that she's moving her lips, silently. She's counting the frames. Day 2. Plating. Steel sheets are laid onto the frame and fused with it. The seams are smooth. The control panel monitors the temperature and pressure at every point. Dan stands knee-deep in the water and guides the sheets by hand. Carlos passes them from the boat. Moon holds the safety lines. By evening, the port side is closed. The starboard side is half done. Day 3. The last sheets of plating. The bottom. The keel. Carlos pulls a heavy rebar, and Dan hears the man exhale through clenched teeth. The rebar falls into place. The panel displays. Hull. Complete. Integrity 94%. 6% loss due to poor welds in the stern. Repairable. Dan inspects the hull. 18 meters of steel and plastic. Rough, heavy, uneven in places, but intact. He taps the hull with his fist. The metal hums, a low, warm sound. Alive. The panel displays the next stage. Internal bulkheads. Deck. Systems. Mast. At least another week of work. But the hull is there. The ship exists. On the 4th day after construction began, sails appear on the horizon. 3 of them. Small. Tattered. Heading straight for them. Dan looks at the panel. 3 vessels. Small. Status. Armed. Armed. He tells Carlos to take the children inside the boat. Marta grabs Ricardo and Inez and hides. Moon takes a knife. Juan grabs a boat hook. Dan stands on the unfinished hull and waits. 3 rafts approach within 200 meters. 3 or 4 people on each. About 10 in total. Tanned, skinny. A homemade crossbow is mounted on one raft. On another, a man holds a spear. Pirates. Rafters who chose not fish, but someone else's property. The lead raft stops. A man with a long scar across his face stands on it. He surveys the boat. A cargo ship, an unfinished hull, solar panels, a desalination unit. His eyes widen. He sees what's here. Everything. Steel, energy, water, food. The man with the scar shouts. He tells them to get lost, that the cargo ship is his now, that everything on it and around it belongs to him. Dan doesn't move. He stands and looks at the pirate rafts. The panel scans them, automatically. 3 rafts. Construction. Barrels and planks. Condition. Poor. 1 raft is leaking. The fastenings are rotten. It'll fall apart at the first serious swell. An engine on the second raft. Gasoline-powered. Homemade. Power output about 3 horsepower. Oil is leaking. The piston is knocking. 100 hours of operation at most. Then it will break down for good. A crossbow. The bowstring is made of braided fishing line. Low tension. Effective range, 40 meters. Can injure, unlikely to kill. Dan takes it all in a matter of seconds, and he sees what matters most. These people need help just as much as the Lopez family. They've just chosen a different way to get it. Dan tells the man with the scar that he can fix his motor. The man falls silent. He didn't expect that. Dan says the engine will break down in 3 months, maybe sooner. The piston assembly is worn out. Oil is leaking through the head gasket. If it isn't fixed within 100 hours of operation, the engine will seize up and turn into a pile of scrap metal. Dan says he can fix it. The man with the scar looks back at his men. They confer, quietly, quickly. The man turns to Dan. He asks what Dan wants for the repair. Dan says he wants them to leave peacefully, and to tell others that they're building a ship here, not a military one, not a merchant one, a ship with room on board. The man with the scar thinks, for a long time. Then he pulls his raft up to the boat. Dan climbs down to the engine. The panel shows every detail. 2-stroke, homemade, assembled from parts of 3 different engines. It's a miracle it works at all. Dan works for an hour. He replaces the gasket. He cuts a new one from a piece of rubber he found on the freighter. He tightens the fasteners. He cleans the carburetor. He pours in oil from his supplies. He adjusts the ignition. The engine starts on the first try. A smooth sound. No knocking. The man with the scar listens. His face changes. The scar on his face seems to fade a little. Or maybe it's just my imagination. He says his name is Thorn. Dan nods. Thorn says he'll come back. Not for the engine, for a spot. Dan says there'll be a spot. 3 rafts sail away. The sails fade into the horizon. Moon lowers his knife. Juan exhales. Carlos steps out of the boat with the children. Marta pulls Inez close. Dan watches the pirates leave and thinks about what just happened. He didn't fight. He didn't threaten. He didn't pay a ransom. He offered what he had in abundance: knowledge, skill, time. And he got what he needed: peace. Construction continues. A week is spent on the interior bulkheads and the deck. Moon finds drifting debris from a raft with planks. Wood. 40 kilograms. Still not enough for a mast, but getting closer. Juan catches fish. Supplies are growing. The desalinator runs around the clock. Water is no longer a problem. Food is still a problem. Fish and seaweed. There's protein. Not enough vitamins. Dan is thinking about hydroponics. There was activated charcoal on the dry cargo ship. If they use it as a substrate and set up a closed-loop irrigation system with fertilizer made from recycled waste. The panel displays a diagram. Hydroponic module, level 1. Area, 4 square meters. Yield, greens in 2 weeks. Tomatoes in a month. Cucumbers in a month and a half. Required, plastic, tubes, pump, substrate, seeds. Seeds. Where to get seeds in a world without soil? The panel is silent. It has no seeds. It has no answer to this question. Dan asks Moon. Moon says the tower dwellers have seeds. Some towers grow plants on their roofs in boxes filled with soil. The soil is brought from mountain peaks that still protrude from the water. Seeds are passed down from generation to generation. They are valued more highly than steel. Nari, Spire 7 Tower. Dan makes a decision. He'll return to Nari. Not in 2 weeks, as he promised. Sooner. But not empty-handed. He'll take what the tower dwellers don't have. A solar panel. 1. 300 watts. For Nari's tower, that means light on every floor, working appliances, maybe even an electric stove. One panel for a handful of seeds. Nari will agree. Dan leaves Carlos, Moon, and Juan at the construction site. He takes a boat. One solar panel, a supply of water, fish, 30 kilometers, 7 hours of pedaling. He arrives at Spire 7 at sunset. This time, the crossbowman recognizes him and lowers his weapon immediately. Nari meets him on the landing pad. She sees the solar panel and her eyes widen. She knows what it is. Her grandfather told her about it. Black plates that catch the sun and turn it into lightning. Dan explains how to connect it. Nari listens. Then she asks what he wants. Dan says, seeds. Nari leads him inside. On the 20th level, there is a room that is guarded. 2 men with crossbows stand at the door. Nari nods to them. They step aside. Inside, boxes of soil, earth, real earth, dark. It smells of life. Green stalks are growing in the boxes. Onions, garlic, something like spinach. And little bags on the shelf. Seeds, rice, wheat, beans, peppers, tomatoes, zucchini, carrots, labeled in neat handwriting. Nari takes 5 bags: tomatoes, beans, spinach, onions, peppers. She hands them to Dan. Dan holds them in his hands. 5 small bags. Together, they weigh less than 50 grams, and they're worth more than all the steel on his boat. This is life. This is the future. This is the chance to feed people with more than just fish. Nari says the panel is worth more than 5 bags. That she owes him. Dan replies that he doesn't count it. Nari looks at him for a long time. Then she says there's a man on the tower who needs to talk to him. She leads him to the top deck. A young woman is sitting by the window in a small room. 27, maybe 28. Short black hair, a calm face. Her hands are folded in her lap. Papers are spread out on the table in front of her. Handwritten charts, graphs, current charts. Nari says this is Kim So-yeon, an oceanographer. She arrived at the tower 6 months ago, the sole survivor from her research vessel. So-yeon looks up at Dan. Her gaze is attentive, assessing, not hostile, more scientific. It's as if she's looking at a specimen under a microscope. So-yeon says that Nari told her about an engineer who fixes things. She says she has data on currents and water temperatures that she's been collecting for 3 years. She says this data reveals something important. A typhoon everyone calls Leviathan. It won't arrive in 3 years. It will arrive in 2, maybe in a year and a half. The data doesn't lie. Ocean temperatures are rising faster than meteorologists from the southern towers predicted. Atmospheric instability is increasing. The window is narrowing. Dan looks at her graphs. The panel scans the papers. Data is loading. Processing, the panel confirms. The So-yeon model is correct. Typhoon Leviathan. Estimated time of arrival, 22 months. Give or take 3. 22 months. Not 3 years, not 2. 22 months to build something that can withstand a storm as tall as a skyscraper. Dan sits down. His legs suddenly feel heavy. He looks at his hands. Cuts from rust, calluses from the pedals, sunburns. With these hands, he built a pontoon, then a motorboat. Then he started on the schooner. In 3 weeks, 22 months, 7 people on board, and he needs an ark. A real one, a big one, for thousands. With Jan watches him. She says she wants to help, that her knowledge of ocean currents and ecosystems will be useful, that she can't just sit in the tower and wait for the storm to come for her. Dan looks at her. The panel displays. Passengers. Update available. So-yeon. Qualifications. Oceanography. Marine biology. Compatibility with the ARC project. High. Dan says yes. So-yeon gathers her papers. Everything she has fits into a single backpack. Papers, homemade devices for measuring temperature and salinity, 3 books on marine biology that she rescued from her ship. Nari sees them off. On the platform, she takes So-yeon by the hands. She says something quietly. So-yeon nods. The boat pulls away from the tower. Now there are two of them. Not in terms of numbers, but in terms of those who understand the scale of the task. So-yeon sits at the stern and looks at the water. She is silent. Dan is silent. Words aren't needed yet. Work is needed. The boat heads back to the dry cargo ship, to the unfinished schooner, to the Lopez family and the two old fishermen. The schooner Arc Zero is launched on the 28th day. 18 meters of steel and plastic, a mast made of welded pipes, sails made of sewn-together pieces of polyethylene reinforced with strands of braided fishing line. Not pretty, but it works. The wind fills the sail and the schooner moves, slowly, heavily, like an old man getting up after a long illness. But it moves. Dan stands on deck and feels the hull respond to the waves, a gentle rocking. The bulkheads creak but hold. The seams aren't leaking. The keel cuts through the water smoothly. The panel shows green across all systems. Hull, stable. Sailing system, operating at 60% of rated power. Desalination unit, active, 200 liters per day. Solar power generation, 3 and 2 kilowatts, 12 panels connected. 8 passengers out of 30. So-yeon stands nearby and looks at the current map she drew over the past 2 days. She says they need to head southwest. That's where 2 warm currents meet. There are more fish in that area, more floating debris, and most importantly, more rafters. If Dan wants to recruit people, he needs to go where they are. Dan agrees. The schooner turns around. The sail catches the crosswind. Moon stands at the helm. The helm is rough, a steel rod with welded handles, but Moon holds it as if it were the wheel of a yacht. 40 years on the water have taught him to feel the waves with his back. The first 3 days pass calmly. So-yeon is working. She has laid out her instruments at the stern and measures the water temperature every hour, salinity, current direction. She records it in a notebook. Dan watches her and sees a person who, for the first time in 6 months, is doing what she was born to do. Her movements are precise, confident, no fuss. She dips the thermometer into the water with the same precision a surgeon uses a scalpel. Dan builds a hydroponic module, 4 square meters on the lower deck, plastic trays, tubes, a pump made from a small motor salvaged from a cargo ship, a substrate of activated charcoal and ground pumice, seeds. He plants tomatoes and beans in the first trays, spinach and onions in the second, peppers in the third. He waters them with filtered water mixed with ground fish bones and seaweed, homemade fertilizer. The panel calculates the proportions: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Not perfect, but enough. 3 days later, the first bean sprouts break through the substrate. Green, thin, fragile. Inez finds them first. She comes to the lower deck and stands in front of the tray. She looks at the sprout. Then she turns to Dan, who is working behind her. And for the first time in all this time, she utters a word.
Alive.
Her voice is quiet, hoarse from the long silence. One word. Alive. Dan freezes. Martha, who was following her daughter, freezes in the doorway. Inez looks at the sprout, then at Dan, then back at the sprout. Martha quietly drops to her knees and covers her mouth with her hand. Dan sits down next to Inez. He says, yes, alive, and that in a month there will be tomatoes here. Inez nods. She says nothing more that day, but she nodded, and she spoke. For the first time since the day Dan pulled the Lopez family out of the water. On the 4th day after sailing away from the freighter, the panel shows a signal. Multiple objects, southwest, distance 20 kilometers. Vessels.
Number: more than 20. Status: mixed.
A caravan of rafters. So-yeon is right. There are more people at the intersection of the currents. Dan steers the schooner toward the caravan. In 5 hours, they catch up. The caravan consists of 26 rafts tied together with ropes in a long chain. On each raft, there are between 3 and 10 people. About 150 in total. Tanned, thin, children, old people, women with infants, men with homemade weapons. The rafting party drifts with the current. It doesn't choose a direction, it just drifts. Wherever the water carries them, they go. A schooner approaches and the caravan freezes. 150 pairs of eyes stare at the steel hull, at the mast, at the solar panels gleaming on the roof, at the white awning, at the people on deck who look not like ghosts, but like living beings. The caravan leader approaches on his raft, a large man in his 50s with sunburned skin and calm eyes. His name is Bravis. He asks who they are. Dan answers. Bravis looks at the schooner with a long, appraising gaze. Then he asks if they have water. Dan says yes, 200 liters a day. Bravis is silent. Then he says their children are dying. 3 children in the last week. Dehydration. The caravan has no desalinator. It rained 2 weeks ago. Their supplies ran out 3 days ago. They're drinking seawater diluted with rainwater. It's killing their kidneys, slowly but surely. Dan doesn't hesitate. He cranks the desalinator up to full power, 200 liters. He pours it into containers they bring from the rafts. Bottles, canisters, barrels, everything they have. 200 liters for 150 people is less than 1.5 liters per person. Not enough. But yesterday, there was none. Bravis stands on the schooner's deck and watches as water pours from the desalination tube into a canister. Clear, pure. He lifts the canister, drinks, closes his eyes, opens them. His eyes are wet. He says that in 20 years of caravan life, he's been offered many things. Gold from the old world, weapons, a spot on the tower, women. No one ever offered just water. Dan replies that water isn't just water. Water is everything. Bravis nods. He asks what Dan wants. Dan says he's building a ship, a big one, for 30 people, then 100, then 1,000. He needs people, not slaves, not soldiers, people who are willing to work. Bravis thinks, for a long time. Then he says there are those in the caravan who want to leave, young ones, strong ones, who feel cramped on the rafts, who want something other than drifting with the current. He'll send them. Dan nods. The schooner stays near the caravan for 3 days. Dan makes water, repairs what he can. One raft is leaking. Dan reinforces it. Another loses a rope. Dan ties it back on. On the 3rd raft, a woman with an injured hand. The cut has become infected. Pus, a fever. Dan isn't a doctor, but the panel shows the ingredients of a seaweed ointment that has antibacterial properties. Soyeon knows which seaweeds are needed. She gathers them from the underside of the rafts. She grinds them, mixes them with fresh water. The ointment isn't perfect, but the fever subsides in a day. The woman smiles. On the 4th day, Bravis sends people. 11 people. 6 men, 4 women, 1 teenager, about 16, all with belongings. A few belongings. Fishing rods, knives, clothes, small items. They climb aboard the schooner and look around. Steel walls, the roof, a floor that doesn't sway beneath their feet like a raft. Solar panels, a desalination unit, hydroponic trays with sprouts. One woman touches the wall with her hand. She strokes the metal. She says the last time she touched steel was when she was 5 years old, and her grandfather showed her an old car sticking out of the water. The display updates. 19 passengers out of 30. The schooner sinks a little deeper. Dan recalculates the load. The buoyancy reserve is sufficient. But the desalinator is now working at its limit. 200 liters for 19 people is 10.5 liters per person. That's fine. But if the crew grows to 30, a second desalinator will be needed. We need power. We need more panels. He connects 20 more. The power output rises to 9 kilowatts. That's enough for a second desalinator. Dan builds it in 2 days. Spare parts from the cargo ship, a rubber membrane, a pump made from a base greep and a piston. 400 liters a day. New people change everything. Not technically, socially. 8 people on board is a family. 19 is no longer a family. It's a collective. And a collective requires rules. The first conflict happens on the second day. A man named Gross from the Bravest caravan takes a spot on the lower deck next to the hydroponic trays. It's warm, dry, sheltered from the wind. Carlos says this is a place for work, not for sleeping. Gross replies that he's worked on a raft for 20 years, and now he'll sleep wherever he wants. Carlos clenches his fists. Moon steps between them. Dan goes down to the lower deck and sees 3 men in various stages of readiness to fight. He doesn't shout. He doesn't give orders. He looks at the lower deck and says that in a week there will be a second workshop here. That requires space. He points to a diagram on the control panel screen. Sleeping modules, compact, bunk style, plastic walls, mattresses made of compressed biomass, each module for 2 people. 10 modules on the upper deck under the canopy, separate, with partitions. Gross looks at the blueprint, then at his spot on the floor, then back at the blueprint. Partitions, personal space. He hasn't slept behind a partition in 20 years. Gross stands up and asks how he can help. The conflict fizzles out. But Dan remembers. People don't fight over territory. They fight over dignity. Gross didn't want this spot. He wanted someone to acknowledge that he deserved a spot. Dan builds the sleeping modules for 3 days. Plastic from the water. The frame is made of thin steel rods, partitions, shelves for belongings, hooks for clothes, little things. But little things that speak to every person. This is yours. You're not a guest here. You live here. When the modules are ready, people choose their spots, quietly, without arguments. Carlos and Marta with the kids take the corner one. Moon and Juan are next to them. Gross takes the one at the very edge of the hull. He grumbles that he can hear the water, but he puts his things on the shelf and spends a long time arranging them, settling in. So-yeon takes the module near the stern, closer to her instruments. She works every day without a day off. Measurements, calculations, current models. She begins to draw a map, a real map of the new world, not with continents that no longer exist, with currents, with temperature zones, with places where there are fish, with places where there are storms, with the coordinates of the towers she remembers and which the rafters from the caravan named. The map grows every day, current lines, tower locations, danger zones. So-yeon draws it on the back of a steel sheet using scratched lines. When Dan first sees the entire map, he stands in front of it for 5 minutes without moving. It's not just a map. It's a model of the world. So-yeon has marked everything she knows on it, every current with its speed and temperature, every zone where the salinity differs, every seasonal storm cycle, and the red zone in the south, the birthplace of Leviathan, where the ocean is warmest, where the atmosphere is most unstable, where, in 20 months, a storm will gather that will consume everything. Dan says he needs a map like this in the system. So-yeon asks what it means. Dan shows her the panel for the first time. He doesn't explain. He just shows her. He activates the interface and rotates it so So-yeon can see the projection. Green lines on the wall. Diagrams. Data. Modules. So-yeon looks. She is silent. For a long time. Then she asks where it came from. Dan says he doesn't know. He woke up with it. So-yeon nods. She is a scientist. She doesn't ask how it's possible. She asks what it can do. Dan explains. Projection. Materialization based on blueprints, provided raw materials are available. Structural analysis. Optimization. So-yeon listens, and for the first time during the entire conversation, tilts her head slightly. She says that if the system can process data, she wants to upload her measurements to it. 3 years of observations, temperatures, salinity, current speeds, wind directions, if the system can process this. Dan nods. He takes So-yeon's notebooks. The panel scans page by page. The data is uploaded. Processing takes an hour. Then the panel displays the result. A three-dimensional model of the ocean within a 2,000-kilometer radius. Currents like colored rivers. Temperature layers like the floors of a building. And in the center of the southern zone, a red vortex, the embryo of Leviathan. Soyeon looks at the model, and her hands tremble for the first time. For 3 years she collected this data, wrote it down in a notebook, calculated it in her head, drew graphs with a pencil. And now her work has taken shape, alive, real. She sees what she felt but couldn't see. A storm is forming, right now, slowly, inevitable. She says quietly that the model is beautiful. Dan says the model is frightening. Soyeon smiles. For the first time, the corners of her lips. She says that beautiful and frightening are one and the same if you're a scientist. Dan remembers that smile. A week passes. The schooner moves along the route Soyeon calculated based on the currents, fuel economy, conservation of energy. Instead of rowing against the current, they use it. Soyeon reads the ocean as Dan reads blueprints. They complement each other. He knows how to build, she knows where to sail. On the 10th day of the journey, a lone raft drifts up to the schooner. On it is a young woman, unconscious, dehydrated, sunburned. Her left arm is bandaged with dirty rags. Blood has seeped through the fabric and dried into a black crust. Moon lifts her aboard. Dan gives her water. Soyeon cleans the wound. A deep cut from her elbow to her wrist. Inflamed. She needs a doctor. They don't have a doctor. Soyeon does what she can. She washes it, applies seaweed ointment, rebandages it with clean cloth. The woman regains consciousness by evening. She opens her eyes, gray, angry, alive. The first thing she does is try to stand up. She falls. She tries again. Moon holds her by the shoulders. She breaks free. Then she sees water, a bottle of fresh water. She freezes. She takes it. She drinks. For a long time, greedily. Then she looks around. Steel walls, the roof, people. She asks where she is. Dan says on a schooner. She asks whose. Dan says his. She laughs, a sharp, short laugh. She says he has a lousy schooner. Then her eyes roll back and she loses consciousness again. Her name is Ashley Morgan. That's what they find out when she comes to for the second time. 24 years old, former speedboat pilot for Poseidon Maritime Corporation, air tier. She ran away 3 weeks ago, stole a boat. The boat had a beacon. Poseidon found her 2 days later. A chase, a shootout. Her boat took a hit. She transferred to a raft, drifted, cut her hand on torn metal during the transfer. 3 weeks, alone. No water, no food, on a raft made of barrels. That she's alive isn't a miracle. It's stubbornness. Ashley sits on the schooner's deck, wrapped in a cloth, and eats fish. She eats so fast that Soyeon has to stop her. It's dangerous to eat too fast after starving. Ashley snaps back. Then she listens. Then she eats more slowly. She asks questions. Lots of questions. Who are they? Where's the ship from? Why is it made of steel? Where did the solar panels come from? Why hydroponics? How many of them are there? Where are they going? Dan answers briefly. Ashley listens, and with each answer, her eyes grow more attentive. She says there's nothing like this on Poseidon. They have nuclear icebreakers, real ships, but they don't have hydroponics, no solar panels, just reactors and guns. She says the schooner is small and ugly, but it has things the icebreakers don't. Food that grows, water that makes itself, a place that belongs to everyone. Ashley stays, not because she has nowhere else to go, but because in 3 days, Dan asks her to take the helm. The schooner enters a crosswind zone. The waves rise. Moon can't handle it. His arms are strong, but his reflexes aren't up to it. Ashley takes the helm, and the schooner levels out in seconds. Her movements are sharp, precise. She feels the water the way Soyeon feels the currents. An hour later, the wind dies down. Ashley lets go of the helm. Month 2. The schooner heads south along Soyeon's route. There are 23 people on board. 3 have joined over the past week. A lone fisherman named Theo, an elderly couple, Gon and Mira, from the wrecked raft. Every new person is a mouth to feed and hands to keep busy. Dan organizes the work, not as a boss, as a coordinator. He sees who has what skills and assigns tasks. Theo is a fisherman, so Theo catches fish and teaches others. Gon is old but has steady hands, so Gon cuts plastic for repairs. Mira weaves nets, quickly, deftly. Her fingers flit. In an hour, she makes as much as Moon does in a day. The system is growing, not just the ship, the people. Everyone finds their place. Everyone sees that their work is becoming part of something bigger. Gross, who was sleeping on the floor a week ago, is now overseeing the unloading of plastic from the water. He stands on deck with a gaff and pulls out pieces, sorts them. Hard plastic goes to Dan. Soft plastic goes for recycling. Membrane-grade plastic is set aside. He does this with the seriousness of a man who has found his calling. In the 3rd week of the 2nd month, the schooner approaches a spot that Soyeon marked on the map as an anomaly. The water temperature here is 2 degrees lower than the surrounding area. The current slows down. There's a lot of trash. And not just trash. Debris from something large is floating on the surface. Metal, plastic, wood, glass, pieces of cable. Dan stops the schooner and scans. The panel shows debris, source, platform class structure, pre-war, approximate size 500 meters by 200. It's an oil platform. It collapsed. It didn't sink completely. Parts of the structure are floating. Parts are lying in shallow water. The panel estimates the depth, 12 meters to the main structures. Steel, tons of steel. Aluminum, copper, cables, pipes, valves, tools. Dan knows oil platforms. He designed life support systems for them. He knows every module, every deck, every system. If at least 30% of the platform remains, that's enough resources for an entire city. The problem is the depth, 12 meters. Diving without equipment is dangerous. Dan thinks. Ashley approaches. She overheard his conversation with Soyeon. She says she dived at Poseidon. Training. 12 meters is the limit for freediving, but she went down to 15. Dan looks at her. Her hand is still bandaged. The cut is healing, but slowly. Ashley catches his gaze. She says she dives with her lungs, not her hand. Dan doesn't argue. He designs the gear. Simple. A weight belt made of lead pieces found on the platform. A mask made of glass and rubber. A cable with a signal knot. A safety rope. Ashley dives the next morning. The first dive is a reconnaissance dive, 3 minutes underwater. She surfaces with wide eyes. She says there's a whole world down there. The platform lies on its side. The living quarters are intact. The doors are closed. The workshop is intact. She saw tools through the window. Wrenches, vices, something resembling a welding machine. Dan draws up a recovery plan. The panel calculates that some items can be lifted by hand. Tools, valves, small parts. For the larger ones, a winch is needed. A winch can be assembled from what's available. Steel cable, a drum, a manual drive. 3 days to build. Ashley dives every day, 4 or 5 times a day. He hauls up whatever he can carry. Day 1. A box of wrenches, a set of 24. Rusty, but steel. Carlos takes them in his hands and runs them through his fingers like rosary beads. Every wrench is a possibility. Every wrench is something the rafters never had. Day 2. A cable reel. 300 meters of copper cable in a plastic sheath. Copper. 15 kilograms of pure copper. These are generator windings. This is electrical wiring. This is the future. Day 3. The winch is ready. Ashley secures the cable to large objects on the seabed. The crew pulls. The first lift. A 4-meter-long steel beam. Clean. No rust. It was protected from water inside the structure. Dan touches its surface. Smooth, cold, high-quality steel. This is the kind used to build ships that have lasted for decades. The hauls go on for a week. New finds every day. The panel catalogs everything. Steel, 300 kilograms. Aluminum, 80. Copper, 30. Tools, 42 items. Valves, 12 pieces of various sizes. A stainless steel pipe, 20 meters. And most importantly, on the 5th day, Ashley brings a small metal box out of the workshop. Airtight, sealed, heavy. Dan opens it. Inside, medical instruments, a surgical kit, scalpels, clamps, tweezers, needles, suture thread. Everything is oiled. Everything is intact. Pre-war quality. Next to it are 5 sealed packets of antibiotics. The date on the packets has worn off, but the packaging is intact, so maybe they're still usable. Dan holds the box in his hands and thinks that somewhere out on this ocean, there's a doctor who needs exactly these instruments. He doesn't yet know that this thought will turn out to be prophetic. The panel updates. Resources for Arc 0 have been exceeded. A new project is available. Arc 0, upgraded. Hull length extended to 24 meters. Addition of a second mast. Installation of a smithy module. Power system rated at 32 kilowatts. Capacity, 50 people. Dan looks at the design. 50. This is no longer a schooner. It's a small ship. He begins the upgrade. The hull is lengthened. A new section is built into the stern. The second mast rises in 3 days. Solar panels are moved to the extended roof. The forging module is a small electric furnace, not for smelting, for forging and cutting. With it, Dan can work metal more precisely, weld better, cut cleaner. This changes the quality of everything he builds. Soyeon watches the upgrades and, for the first time, initiates a conversation not about work. In the evening, she approaches Dan at the stern. He's sitting there, checking the blueprints on the panel. She sits down next to him. She's silent for a minute. Then she says he reminds her of her captain, the one on the research vessel. He didn't sleep either. He checked everything himself too. He didn't notice that the people around him were living beings, not just cogs in a machine. Dan turns to her. Soyeon isn't looking at him. She's looking at the water. She says the captain died with everyone else when the ship sank, that she was the only one to survive on a life raft, that for 6 months on the Nari Tower, she woke up every night to check if the floor beneath her was sinking. Dan is silent. He doesn't know what to say. He's an engineer. He solves problems. But this problem can't be solved with a wrench. Soyeon gets up and goes to her room. Dan sits at the stern and looks at the stars. The panel flickers quietly. He thinks about something that has nothing to do with ships or steel. He thinks for a long time. Then he opens the panel and starts a new project. A small one. A personal one. Not for the Ark. For one person. A laboratory. 4 square meters. A stainless steel table. Shelves for samples. Mounts for instruments. Lighting. A separate power supply from solar panels. A porthole in the hull so instruments can be lowered into the water without going out on deck. A small detail, but a telling one. I see what you need. The end of the 2nd month. 31 people on board. The schooner is now a 24-meter, 2-masted ship with a smithy, desalinators, hydroponics, and a laboratory that appeared at the stern 2 days ago. Dan built it overnight. In the morning, Soyeon went down to the lower deck and stopped in the doorway. A stainless steel table, shelves, mounts, a porthole in the hull, a special hatch through which a thermometer or sampler could be lowered directly into the water without coming up on deck. Soyeon stood and looked. Then she walked over to the table. She ran her finger along the surface. Then she turned to face Dan. He was standing behind her, leaning against the bulkhead. She asked why. Dan replied that her data was critical for navigation and she needed a proper workspace. Soyeon looked at him. 3 seconds, 4, then she nodded and began setting out her instruments. She didn't say anything else, but as Dan was leaving, he heard her quietly place her 3 books on marine biology. Neatly, in order of height. just like in a real laboratory. On the 32nd day of the voyage, the schooner approaches the point Soyeon marked as a possible cluster of towers. 3 peaks of former skyscrapers within a 5-kilometer radius. A tower cluster. Soyeon explains that clusters form around former business centers where skyscrapers once stood densely. The upper floors jut out of the water, and the tower dwellers build crossings between them. Cable bridges, pontoon walkways, cable lines. It turns out to be a small city on stilts. Dan sees it from a kilometer away. 3 towers, cables and walkways between them, rain collectors and antennas on the roofs. Platforms and balconies line the walls. People move between the towers like ants on branches. It's bigger than Spire 7 Nari. Much bigger. The panel scans. 3 structures. Height above water, 15 to 25 stories. Population, approximately 300 people. Power supply, wind turbines, at least 7. Water supply, rain collectors. Estimated capacity, 600 liters per day. For 300 people, that's 2 liters per person. Survival, not life. The schooner is approaching, and the reaction is different from Spire 7's. Not 1 crossbowman, 5. No questions. A warning shot. The bolt plunges into the water 10 meters in front of the bow. Dan stops the ship. Ashley takes the helm and holds the schooner in place. A group of people appears on the balcony of the middle tower. 12 people, armed, crossbows, spears. One of them has something resembling a homemade rifle. At the front is a man in dark clothing, gray hair, straight back, a stern face. He speaks loudly and clearly. He introduces himself. Elder Pak, head of the cluster. He asks what they want. Dan replies that he has come to trade. Pak asks what for. Dan, fresh water, solar panels, equipment repairs, engineering services. Pak is silent. Then he asks where they got the steel ship. Dan replies that he built it. Pak is silent for longer. Then he says they can come closer, but without weapons. Dan nods. Moon grumbles that they don't have any weapons anyway. The negotiations go on for half a day. Pak is a tough negotiator. He wants a lot and gives little. Dan doesn't haggle. He makes an offer. 1 solar panel for 20 kilograms of steel and seeds. Repairing the wind turbines in exchange for access to the flooded floors of the towers. Desalinated water for free. No strings attached. Pak doesn't believe it. Free water. In a world where water is currency. He asks what the catch is. Dan replies that there is no catch. That he is building a ship. That he needs allies, not clients. That in 20 months a storm will come that will destroy all 3 towers. Pak is skeptical. He's heard of Leviathan. Everyone has. But he doesn't trust self-taught meteorologists. They've been wrong before. Dan doesn't argue. He suggests that Park talk to Soyeon. Soyeon arrives with data, with graphs, with a 3D model that the panel projects onto the wall of the conference room. Green lines of currents, a red vortex in the south. Park watches. His advisors watch. They are silent. Soyeon explains calmly and methodically. Every figure, every fact. She isn't scaring them. She is informing them. Park listens for 30 minutes without interrupting. Then he asks one thing. What she proposes. Soyeon says she proposes an evacuation. Not now. In a year, when the arc is big enough. You can't remove people from the towers without preparing a place for them. But in a year, Dan will build a ship that can hold all 300 residents of the cluster. If Park starts preparing the people now, if he allocates resources that won't be needed on the tower in case the towers have to be abandoned, Park thinks. This is a decision that requires not minutes, days. He says he'll give an answer later, but for now, they can stay. Dan stays for 3 days. He repairs the generators. 2 out of 7 weren't working. Now they are. He installs a solar panel. The tower dwellers look at it as if it were a miracle. A black plate on the roof that gives light when there's no wind. Light at night. Stable. Reliable. On the 2nd day, Park sends his daughter to him. 19 years old. Quiet. Wearing glasses, she repairs herself. The wire frames are wrapped with thread in 3 places. She says her name is Park Hae-won, that her father sent her to find out more about the ship. Ha-won speaks 4 languages, Korean, English, Japanese, Mandarin. She learned them from books found in the flooded libraries on the lower decks. She dived down for them herself. She asks Dan questions, precise, systematic. How the desalinator works, what the principle is, what the capacity is, what resources are needed to build it. Dan answers, and with each answer, he sees how Haewon processes the information, quickly, completely, without loss. She isn't an engineer, she's an analyst. She thinks in terms of systems, connections, consequences. An hour later, Haewon says she understands that Dan's ship isn't military or commercial, that it's a prototype, that every element on board is connected to every other, that the water purifier feeds the hydroponics. The hydroponics feeds the people maintain the systems sustain the ship protects the people. A closed loop, like an ecosystem. Dan looks at her and for the first time sees someone who understands his project not as a collection of parts, but as a single unified whole. He says yes, that's exactly it. Haewon nods. Then she says she wants to stay on the ship. Not as a guest, as a crew member. Dan asks, "What about your father?" Haewon replies that her father sent her here for exactly that purpose. Half hostage, half diplomat. A guarantee of communication between the tower and the ship. If Haewon is on board, Park will know what's happening. And Dan will know that Park won't attack. Dan understands the calculation. Politics. Tower politics. Haewon isn't just a girl in glasses. Haewon is an investment, a gamble, a pawn on the board. He looks at her and sees something in her eyes that doesn't fit the role of a diplomat. Fatigue. Not physical. Fatigue from being used your whole life. From knowing your value lies in your surname, not in yourself. Dan says, "Welcome aboard." Haewon nods. She doesn't smile, but her shoulders drop slightly. The tension eases, just a millimeter. The schooner leaves Pack's cluster with a new crew member and an agreement to cooperate. Pack didn't say yes to evacuation, but he said yes to trade, steel in exchange for solar panels, seeds in exchange for repairs, information for information. A start. Dan stands on deck and counts. 32 people, a two-masted ship, a smithy, 2 desalinators, hydroponics, a lab, a medical kit without a doctor, a trade agreement with the tower cluster, contact with the Bravis caravan, contact with Nari on Spire 7. This is no longer a pontoon. This is no longer survival. This is construction. The panel displays a new project. The 3rd month begins with a storm. Not Leviathan, just a regular tropical storm. But for the schooner carrying 38 people, including 6 newcomers from the drifting rafts, this is the first real test. The panel shows the storm 4 hours before it hits. The pressure is dropping. The wind is shifting direction. The water temperature jumps half a degree. Soyeon confirms it. She sensed it this morning from the smell of the air. Salty, sharp, like before tears. 4 hours. Dan uses every minute. Clear everything off the deck. Secure the desalinators. Close the hatches. Lower the topsails. Leave the storm sail up. A small triangle of triple-layer polyethylene. Check every seam in the hull, every bolt, every rivet. The scanner scans and finds 3 weak spots. A seam on the starboard side near the stern. The mast's attachment to the deck. The joint between the old and new sections of the hull. Dan reinforces each one. Steel plates, extra bolts, welding. The forge is running until the last minute. Gross helps out. His hands now know the tools like the backs of his hands. He holds the sheet of steel while Dan welds. Doesn't tremble, doesn't ask questions, just holds it. 3 hours later, the schooner is ready. The crew heads below deck. The hatches are closed. Ashley is at the helm. Dan is beside her. So-yeon is at the charts. Moon is at the bow. Juan is at the stern. Carlos is holding the children. The storm hits. Not gradually, all at once. The sky turns from gray to black in 10 minutes. The wind hits like a fist. The schooner heels to starboard. A wave crashes into the bow. Water floods the deck. It drains through the scuppers. Another wave. The ship heels to port. Ashley turns the wheel. The ship rights itself. Another wave. Another list. Dan holds onto the railing and looks at the panel. The indicators are yellow all over the hull. The load on the seams is approaching the design limit. The seam at the stern, the one he reinforced 3 hours ago, is holding, but it's creaking. Dan hears the creak of steel through the roar of the wind. That's a bad sound. The sound of metal thinking about giving up. Dan heads down to the stern, across the flooded deck, water up to his knees. A wave washes over the side and knocks him off his feet. He grabs the rail, gets up, keeps going. He finds the seam. The plate is in place. The bolts are holding. But a gap has appeared between the plate and the hull. Water is seeping in, not much. But if the storm lasts another 3 hours, the gap will get bigger. Dan activates the panel, directed vibration, not for destruction, for fusion. He presses his palm against the joint. Paw panel calculates the frequency. The metal heats up beneath his fingers. The edges fuse together. The gap closes. The seam holds. Dan climbs back up to the deck. The wind howls. The waves crash. The schooner sways like a pendulum. But she isn't sinking. She's holding on. The storm lasts 8 hours. 8 hours of listing and waves and wind and a black sky. Ashley doesn't leave the helm once. Her hands are white with tension. Her face is wet. Her eyes are open. She steers the ship through the waves as one would lead a horse through a burning forest. Not by force, with feeling. Every turn of the wheel at the right moment. Every degree of list is compensated for. Moon stands at the bow and shouts the direction of the waves. His voice is drowned out by the wind, but Ashley hears him, or senses him. She turns a second before the wave hits, and the schooner takes it with her bow rather than her side. Right. Safe. The storm subsides by nightfall. The wind dies down. The waves subside. The sky remains black, but not menacing, just night. Dan inspects the ship. Damage. The awning over the stern is gone. One solar panel has been torn off and washed overboard. The storm sail's blade is torn. The hydroponic trays on the lower deck have shifted. 2 are broken. The beans are scattered across the floor. Inez gathers them, every pod, every seed. She crawls across the wet floor and picks them up with her fingers, silently, intently. Marta tries to pull her away. Inez shakes her head and keeps gathering. These are her beans. She saw them sprout. She won't let them go to waste. Dan crouches down beside her and helps. Together, they gather everything. Inez puts the beans back in the tray. She smooths out the soil. She waters them. Then she looks up at Dan and says the second word of her new life. Thank you. Dan nods. The morning after the storm, the sun returns, red, fierce, scorching. But after 8 hours of darkness, it looks like a friend. The crew comes out onto the deck, wet, tired, alive. 38 people. Everyone is safe. Not a single one washed overboard. Not a single one injured. The schooner is battered but afloat. Dan stands on the deck and looks at the people. They stand and look at each other. Then someone starts laughing. Gross. He's standing knee-deep in the water that hasn't yet drained from the deck. And he's laughing. Loudly, hoarsely, contagiously. Moon joins in. Then Carlos. Then Ashley, who has finally let go of the wheel and can't straighten her fingers. She laughs and shakes her hands. 38 people stand on the deck of a battered ship in the middle of the endless ocean and laugh. Not because it's funny, because they're alive. This is the moment, the very one, when a crowd of people on a ship becomes a crew. Dan sees it, Soyeon sees it. Haewon stands aside and watches. She isn't laughing, but she's writing something down in a small notebook. Haewon writes everything down. Dan begins repairs. The awning is restored in a day. The sail is sewn up. The hydroponic trays are reattached. The lost solar panel is replaced from the spare. But the storm didn't just cause damage. It provided data. The panel recorded every moment, every load, every list. every oscillation. Dan analyzes them for 3 days. Weak points, overload zones, moments when the hull was close to its limit. He finds 12 places that need reinforcing, 3 design decisions that need changing, 1 calculation error that could have cost lives if the storm had lasted 2 hours longer. He fixes everything, quietly, without fanfare, a few hours every day, reinforcing, replacing, strengthening. So-yeon notices. She asks what he's doing. Dan replies that he's studying, that the storm was a test, that the ship passed, but not with flying colors. And he needs flying colors, because Leviathan won't settle for a C. So-yeon is silent. Then she says she wants to help, that her data on winds and waves could improve the whole load model, that if they combine her meteorological data with his engineering calculations, they can predict weak spots before they become a problem. Dan looks at her. She's standing in the doorway of her lab. Behind her is a table with instruments, shelves with books, a porthole through which the water is visible. Everything is in its place. He says yes. They work together for 3 evenings in a row, his panel and her notebooks, his drawings and her graphs. The data merges into the model. The panel shows the ship in a 3-dimensional projection. Each node is a color. Green, safe. Yellow, caution. Red, danger. The model accounts for wind direction, wave height, current speed. It predicts the load on every seam, down to the minute. Dan looks at the model and realizes for the first time that he can't do this alone. Not physically, intellectually. So-yeon sees what he doesn't see. She understands the ocean. He understands steel. Together, they understand the ship. So-yeon sits next to him and looks at the model. Their shoulders almost touch. Dan notices this. So-yeon doesn't move away. She points to a red dot near the stern seam. The 4th month. Arc 0 carries 46 people. The hull has been reinforced after the storm. 2 desalinators produce 500 liters a day. Hydroponics feeds the crew fresh greens. The forge is in operation every day. Gross has become a blacksmith. Not a trained one, a self-appointed one. He stands by the furnace from dawn and strikes the red-hot metal with a hammer. Dan showed him the basics. Gross figured out the rest on his own. A month later, his knives are stronger than the ones made on the towers. 2 months later, the tower dwellers come to him for tools. The schooner has become a point on the map, not an official one, a word-of-mouth one. The rafters pass the word among themselves. There's a ship, a steel one. They give out water there. They fix things there. They don't shoot there. 2 or 3 rafts come to Cove, 2 or 3 rafts a week. Some for water, others for repairs. Still others stay. Dan takes in anyone who wants to work. The panel counts. 46. The schooner's limit is 50. We need Arc 1. Dan launches the project. A frigate. 60 meters. 150 people. Resources. 2 tons of steel. 300 kilograms of aluminum. 50 kilograms of copper. 200 cubic meters of wood. 40 solar panels. He doesn't have even half of that. But he has a plan. So-yeon calculated a route through 3 points. First, a flooded port on the site of the former Busan. Depth 15 meters. The dock structures should be intact. Steel. Tons of steel. Second, a mountain peak in the archipelago of the former Philippines. Tower dwellers who, according to rumors, trade in pre-war electronics. Third, a spot in the open ocean where So-yeon detected a magnetic anomaly. She doesn't know what it is, but the anomaly is stable, metallic, large. Something lies on the seabed. The journey will take 2 months. Dan announces this to the crew. He doesn't order them. He explains. He shows So-yeon's map. He shows the Arc 1 project. He shows data on Leviathan. 15 months. Every week counts. People listen. Gross asks who will stay on the schooner while they're at sea. Dan replies that the whole schooner will go. All together. Gross nods. Ashley asks about pirates. The route passes through an area the rafters call the Rust Belt, a concentration of pirate fleets. Dan replies that they have no weapons and won't have any. Ashley raises an eyebrow. Dan says that weapons attract those who want to take them away. The workshop attracts those who want to fix the engine. Ashley is silent. Then she smiles. The schooner sets out on the route. So-Young is leading. Her map of the currents saves days. Arc Zero glides along the currents like a train on rails. Minimum effort, maximum speed. Ashley is at the helm. She already knows the ship like her own body. Every creak, every roll, every response of the rudder to a turn of the wheel. Haewon sits on the upper deck and keeps a log. She records everything down. The route, the weather, the crew's mood, water consumption, the amount of fish. Dan didn't ask her to do this. She started on her own. In the second week, she comes to him with an analysis. Water consumption per person has dropped by 12% after gross organized shifts at the desalinator. The fish catch has increased by 20% after Theo switched to night fishing. 3 of the newcomers aren't working. 2 are sick. 1 just doesn't want to. Dan asks who doesn't want to. Haewon gives a name. Rom, a big man from the raft. Silent, sitting at the stern, staring into the water. Doesn't help, doesn't talk, doesn't eat with the others. Dan goes over to him. Rom sits at the stern, holding a piece of rope in his hands. He ties knots, unties them, ties them again. Dan sits down next to him. He's silent. 5 minutes. 10. Then he looks at the knots. They're complex, professional, nautical knots that Dan has only seen in textbooks. A bowline, a figure 8, constrictor, bowline. Each one is executed flawlessly. Dan says he needs a rigger, someone who knows how to work with cables and ropes. Rom doesn't answer. Dan says that the Arc One will have a standing rigging made of steel cable, that every knot must be rated for a load of 1 ton, that he himself doesn't know how to tie such knots. Rom looks up, for the first time. Dan sees in those eyes neither laziness nor anger. Emptiness. Rom has lost someone. It's written in every movement of his hands. He ties knots because his hands remember the work, even when he himself doesn't want to live. Dan doesn't ask who he lost. He simply places a piece of steel cable next to Rom, thick, stiff. You can't tie something like that just like that. You need a tool. You need strength. You need a purpose. Rom looks at the cable. Then he picks it up. A week later, he makes the first steel sling for the winch. Perfect. On the 6th day of the voyage, the schooner enters the Rust Belt. The water here is murky with rust. Shipwrecks float on the surface. Lots of wrecks. Hundreds of sunken ships have left behind them a field of metal debris the size of a small country. The scanner scans continuously. Steel, aluminum, copper, resources everywhere. But danger, too. Sails on the horizon. 5, 10, more. Pirate fleets. The Rust Belt is their home. Here, they scavenge the wreckage and rob passing ships. First contact is peaceful. A single raft. On it, a woman with a child. She asks for water. Dan gives it to her. She thanks him and leaves. The second encounter is less peaceful. 3 rafts with armed men. They approach within 100 meters. They survey the schooner. One shouts to hand over the panels from the roof. Dan stands on deck and says nothing. Ashley stands beside him. She whispers that the raft on the far left is a Poseidon Scout. She recognizes the model of the binoculars one of the men is using. Corporate. Standard issue. They only give those to officers. Dan looks at the raft. The man with the binoculars looks at them, not at the schooner. At Ashley. He recognized her. The rafts are leaving, quickly, without a word. Ashley stands on the deck and her face pales. She says that Poseidon knows, that they're here, that she's here, that they have a steel ship with solar panels and a desalination team, that this information will reach Captain Marcus Hall on the icebreaker Leviathan within a week. Dan asks what Hall will do. Ashley answers, he'll send a reconnaissance mission, then an offer, then an ultimatum, then gunboats. Hall doesn't tolerate competition, and a ship that's growing and taking on people is a competitor. Dan is silent. Then he says they have a week. In a week, they need to gather enough resources for Arc 1, get out of the Rust Belt, and start construction. The schooner accelerates. So-yeon recalculates the route. Instead of 3 points, 2. Busan and the anomaly. The Philippines are canceled. There's no time. Dan works 20 hours a day. He sends Ashley on dives, the point of the magnetic anomaly. The open ocean. The water is calm. The sun is at its zenith. The schooner drops anchor. The anchor is homemade. A steel block on a cable. Soo-yeon checks the coordinates. She says they're in position. The anomaly is below. The panel scans the seabed. Depth, 30 meters. A structure on the seabed. Large. Metal. Length? The panel processes the data for a minute. 2. 3. Then it displays a number. 900 meters. Dan reads it again. 900 meters. A structure 900 meters long at a depth of 30 meters. Soo-yeon stands nearby and looks at the data. She says it's impossible. No pre-war vessel was 900 meters long. The largest aircraft carriers didn't exceed 400. The panel continues its analysis. Structure, class, unknown. Material, steel, titanium alloys, composite polymers. Energy signature, detected. Sleep mode, arc system. Compatibility, confirmed. Dan stands on the deck and feels a chill run down his spine. Compatibility confirmed. His system recognizes this structure. The panel displays a new line. Object identified. Project Noah. Central core. Status. Mothballed. Awaiting activation. Time since mothballing. 71 years. 71 years. Project Noah was mothballed a year before the Great Thaw. Someone built this. Someone hid it at the bottom. Someone was waiting. Dan shows the data to the crew. Not everyone. So-yeon, Ashley, Haewon, Moon, Carlos, those who've been with him from the start. So-yeon looks at the numbers and says nothing. Ashley whistles. Haewon takes notes. Moon shakes his head and says the world is full of surprises for those who know how to dive deep. Carlos asks if they can bring it up. Dan replies that not now. 30 meters. The structure is at 900 meters. To bring it up, they need infrastructure they don't have. Pontoons, winches, compressors, power, people, hundreds of people. It's a year-long operation, maybe longer. But now they know it exists. And they know where. The panel saves the coordinates. Dan marks a point on the map. The central core. So-yeon adds it to her steel map. A red circle. The target. The schooner departs. Behind them, the quiet ocean stretches over the sleeping leviathan of steel and titanium. Ahead lies Busan. Former Busan, now a sunken port at the bottom of the sea. The journey takes 9 days. So-yeon navigates by the currents. Ashley is at the helm. Haewon translates the radio communications that the homemade receiver picks up. Snippets, crackling, voices in different languages. Korean, Japanese, English, Mandarin. Haewon understands it all. She sits by the receiver for hours and takes notes. Most of it is ship captains chatting among themselves. Trade, gossip, complaints about the weather. But one night, Haewon hears something else. A signal on the Poseidon Corporation's frequency, encrypted. She can't decode the text, but recognizes the format. Short packets, coordinates, directions, orders. Poseidon is coordinating something in this area. Ashley listens to the recording and turns pale. She says it's a tactical deployment format. Gunboats, 3 or 4, moving in a fan formation, looking for someone, looking for them. Dan changes course. So-yeon calculates a detour. Through the cold current coming from the north. There's more fog in it. It'll be harder for the schooner to spot them. 2 days in the fog. Damp, cold air. Water on the walls. Water on the deck. Water on their faces. Visibility, 50 meters. Ashley navigates by the instruments. The panel works like a radar. It shows objects within a kilometer radius. On the second day of fog, the panel flashes red. Object. Distance, 400 meters. Type, vessel. Class, gunboat. Power source, diesel engine. Speed, 12 knots. Direction, crossing the schooner's course. Everyone freezes. Dan orders everything shut down. Desalinators, generators, everything that hums and runs. Silence. The schooner drifts in the fog. 46 people hold their breath. The sound of a diesel engine. Distant, drawing nearer. Louder. Closer. The panel shows the distance. 300 meters. 200. 150. Dan sees the outline through the fog. A gray hull. Low. Predatory. A bow. Homemade but real. The gunboat passes by. It doesn't see them. The fog hides the schooner. The diesel engine roars. A wave from the gunboat rocks the schooner. Inez grabs her mother's hand. Ricardo covers his mouth with his palm. Gross stands by the forge and grips the hammer. The sound of the diesel engine recedes. 200 meters. 300. 500. A kilometer. Silence. Dan exhales. So-Yun exhales. Ashley stands at the helm, her hands white. She says quietly that it was Gunboat 7. She recognizes it by the sound of the engine. The commander is Lieutenant Brash, a cruel man. If he had seen them, he wouldn't have asked any questions. The schooner moves on, through the fog, through the fear. 400 kilometers to Busan. The former Busan greets them on the 10th day. Mountains, real mountains, rising out of the water. Green, covered with trees. The first greenery most of the crew has seen. Trees, real trees. Ricardo shouts and points. Inez stands at the bow and watches. Her lips move. She's counting the trees. Between the mountains, water. A former bay, now a strait. A city underwater. Port cranes stick out of the water like dinosaur skeletons. Building roofs are visible in the clear spots. Dan scans the seabed. Dock structures at depths ranging from 8 to 20 meters. Steel, concrete, machinery, cranes, winches, chains, thousands of tons of material, enough for 10 arcs. But it's impossible to lift it all. Dan sets priorities. Steel beams from the dock structures, chains, winch mechanisms, copper cable from the port infrastructure, and, if we're lucky, an engine, diesel or electric, anything that can propel the ship without wind. Ashley dives, deeper than before. 15 meters. 18. Dan builds her gear. A weight vest with precisely calculated buoyancy. Fins made of molded plastic. A headlamp, waterproof, powered by a small solar panel. Ashley dives and surfaces. Dives and surfaces. Every day. She hauls up whatever she can. Heavy items are lifted with a winch. Ram ties steel slings. His knots hold a ton. 2. 5. In 2 weeks in Busan, they haul up 3 tons of steel, 200 kilograms of copper, a set of dock chains, an industrial-grade manual winch, and an engine. Not a diesel one, electric, asynchronous, industrial, 80 kilowatts of power. The windings are intact. The rotor is intact. The bearings need replacing, but it's doable. 80 kilowatts. If connected to solar panels, it's propulsion. Slow, 3 or 4 knots, but steady. No wind, no pedaling, real electric propulsion. Dan looks at the motor and does the math. 89 panels yield 26 kilowatts. The motor needs 80 at full power. At 1/3 power, 27 will suffice. That's 1 knot of speed. Not enough. But combined with the sails, it's the difference between life and death in a calm. Dan begins construction of Arc 1 right here, in the bay of the former Busan, protected waters, resources at our feet. The mountains provide wood, the first real wood in 4 months. The crew chops down trunks on the slopes. Hard work, but the men are singing. Dan hears Gross belt out some kind of rafters song, and the rest join in. The whole of Arc 1 rises from the bay's waters. Pusan Bay, 2 months of construction. Arc 1 stands on the water. 60 meters of steel and wood, 3 decks, 6 compartments, 2 masts with sails made of multi-layer polymer, an electric motor at the stern, a smithy, a workshop, a medical bay. The So-Yun laboratory has been doubled in size, a 20-square-meter hydroponic farm, a desalination system producing 1,000 liters a day, and people. 120 people. They had been coming all this time. Rafters, tower dwellers, refugees from destroyed platforms, loners, families. Rumors of a ship being built in the bay spread through the currents faster than a fish swims. Among those who came was Jessica Riley. She arrived in the 6th week of construction on a small boat with 2 patients she hadn't had time to finish treating. A doctor, a surgeon, the only one for 1,000 miles. Dan saw her hands when she climbed aboard. A surgeon's hands. Long fingers, precise movements. Not a single unnecessary gesture. She inspected the medical station. She saw the surgical kit that Ashley had retrieved from the platform months ago. She picked up the scalpel, turned it over in her fingers, put it back. She said the instruments were good. The workspace was not. Dan asked what she needed. Jess listed it. A sterile box, an autoclave for sterilization, a light that doesn't flicker, a table with clamps, shelves for medications, ventilation. Separate from the living quarters. Dan wrote it down. Not on paper, in the panel, every item. Soyeon helped with the ventilation. She calculated the airflow. Gross forged the table mounts. Ram made the suspension system for the lamps. Ha-won found glass for the observation window in the flooded buildings of Busan. The operating room took 6 weeks to build, based on Jess's blueprints, with her comments. She came every day. She touched the walls. She checked the corners. She said the table was 2 centimeters higher than it should be. Dan lowered it by 2 centimeters. She said the light was too yellow. Dan changed the lamp's spectrum. Every detail according to her word. Not because she's fussy, because in an operating room, every centimeter and every lumen is someone's life. The operating room was ready by the 8th week. Jess walked in, closed the door, turned on the light. Even white, no flickering. She placed her hands on the table. Smooth stainless steel. She turned on the autoclave. A quiet hum. Functional. Steady. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. Slowly. Evenly. Like a person who had come home after 10 years of wandering. Then she opened the door and said she was ready to work. She performed her first surgery that same day. Appendicitis in a 14-year-old boy from the raft. A classic case. In a normal world, 10 minutes on the table. Here, 40, because the antibiotics are expired, and she has to be more careful with the dosage. The boy survived. Jess left the operating room with red eyes. Not from fatigue. She sat down next to Dan on the deck. Night. Stars. Silence. She didn't say a word. She just sat there. Dan was silent beside her. Half an hour later, she got up and went to bed. The next morning, she smiled for the first time since coming aboard. Among those who had arrived was one more, Yuna Sun, 22 years old, petite, lively. She arrived in her 9th week on the wreckage of something that used to be a yacht. She had a homemade guitar made from a plastic canister and 3 strings of fishing line. Yuna didn't ask to come aboard. She just climbed up. She looked around, she said it was beautiful here, and she started playing. 3 strings, a plastic body. The sound was thin and raspy. But a melody, a real melody. The people on deck stopped what they were doing. Gross put down his hammer. Moon stopped mending the net. Inez came out of the hold and sat down on the deck. Yuna played and sang. Her voice was low for her size, clear, strong. She sang something without words, just sound, just a voice, just a living person reminding other living people that they are alive. When she finished, it was quiet on deck. Then someone clapped. Then everyone. Yuna bowed and said she'd accept payment in food. She stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, because people listen here. In the 10th week, a vessel entered the bay. Not a raft, not a motorboat. A ship. Steel, 30 meters, with a cannon on the bow, flying the Poseidon maritime flag. Dan stood on the deck of Ark 1 and watched as the ship entered the bay. Ashley was beside him. Her face was stony. She recognized the ship. A Storm-class escort frigate, a crew of 25, 130mm automatic cannon, speed 18 knots. Against the Ark 1, which manages 4 knots on its electric motor, it's like a wolf against a turtle. The frigate stopped 200 meters away. A launch was lowered from it, 3 people in the launch, 1 in uniform, an officer. He climbed aboard the Ark. He introduced himself. Lieutenant Commander Vance, from the embassy of Captain Marcus Hall, commander of the Poseidon Maritime Fleet. He came to talk, not to shoot. For now. Vance inspected the Ark, silently, methodically, every deck, every module, every system. His face betrayed nothing. He had been trained not to show anything. But Dan saw his eyes widen for a split second when he saw the hydroponic farm. Fresh greens on a ship. You don't even find that on Hall's icebreaker. Vance relayed the proposal. Captain Hall invites Dan to negotiations. In person, on board the Leviathan. Guaranteed safety, free passage. The purpose of the negotiations? Cooperation. Dan asked what kind of cooperation. Vance answered evasively. Captain Hall believes that Dan's resources and Poseidon's resources complement each other, that together they can do more than apart, that the world is too small for competition. Ashley stood behind Dan, her fists clenched. She knew what cooperation meant in Poseidon's vocabulary. Takeover. Dan replied that he would think about it. Vance nodded, left a frequency for communication, went down to the launch. The frigate departed. That evening, Dan called a meeting. Soyeon, Ashley, Haewon, Moon, Carlos, Jess, Gross, Rom. 8 people. The thinkers. The ones he trusts. Ashley says it's a trap. That Hall doesn't negotiate. He takes. Soyeon says the data on the Leviathan Typhoon confirms one thing. Neither the Ark nor Poseidon will survive on their own. The Typhoon will destroy everyone. We need to unite. The question is on whose terms. Haewon says her father Park would say they should go, to find out what the enemy wants. Information is more valuable than safety. Moon says old fishermen don't go visiting sharks. Carlos says they have no choice. Poseidon's guns will get them in any cove. Jess is silent. Then she says that if Dan goes, he should take her along. Because if it's a trap, he'll need a doctor. Gross pounds his fist on the table and says he'll go instead of Dan. Rom silently places a knife on the table. His voice. The first one. Dan makes a decision. The icebreaker Leviathan. 200 meters of steel. A nuclear reactor. 4 cannons. A crew of 600. It stands in the open ocean like a mountain. Gray, massive, immovable. Ark 1 approaches within a mile and shuts down its engine. A lifeboat with 3 passengers pulls away from the side. Dan, Soyeon, Haewon. Dan climbs the gangway onto the Leviathan's deck, and the first thing he sees is order. Perfect order. Every rope is neatly coiled. Every surface is clean. Sailors in uniform, boots polished, eyes straight ahead. Not a speck of rust anywhere, not a scrap of trash anywhere. This is a warship, and it is maintained like a warship. Dan looks and sees the difference. On the Ark, ropes hang wherever it's convenient. Tools lie where they were tossed. Children run across the deck. Yuna plays the guitar whenever she wants. The chaos of a living place. Here, the order of a dead machine. Every person in their place. Every movement is on schedule. Beautiful and terrifying. Captain Marcus Hall meets them in the wardroom. Tall, gray-haired, 52 years old. A face carved from stone. Gray eyes, calm, intelligent. He doesn't look like a villain. He looks like a man who has made difficult decisions every day for 20 years and has stopped flinching at them. Hall shakes Dan's hand, firmly. Confidently. He looks him in the eye. Dan looks back. 2 engineers, 2 builders, 2 men who understand how the world works and who have chosen different ways to fix it. Hall says he's glad to meet him, that he's heard about the Ark, that he's impressed, that a man who builds ships out of junk and takes aboard anyone who knocks deserves respect. Then he says, but. There's always a but. He says the Ark is a beautiful project, but vulnerable. 1 pirate fleet, 1 epidemic, 1 serious storm, and 112 people are dead. That Dan is building a paradise for 100, and Hall is trying to save 50,000. That the difference is that Hall is willing to make the count, willing to decide who to save and who not to, willing to pay the price Dan refuses to pay. Dan listens. He doesn't argue, doesn't interrupt. Hall speaks for 10 minutes. He lays out his vision. Poseidon Maritime is order, hierarchy, discipline. Resources are distributed based on merit. The strong protect the weak. But the strong decide who is weak and who is not. A system that has been working for 20 years, 50,000 people under the fleet's protection. Cities on platforms, factories, shipyards. A normal life. Almost. Dan asks one thing. How many people has Poseidon lost in the last year? Hall is silent. Then he answers. 3,000. Storms, disease, accidents on the platforms, and piracy. Dan nods. 3,000 out of 50. 6%. He asks if Hall knows about the Leviathan typhoon. Hall knows. His meteorologists are predicting it in 2 years. Soyeon stands up. She lays out her data on the table in the wardroom. Graphs, numbers, maps. She says 2 years is an optimistic forecast, that her data shows 8 months, maybe 10, that ocean temperatures are rising exponentially, that the atmosphere is already unstable, that the interim storms will intensify every month leading up to Leviathan. Hall looks at the data. His meteorologists look. They are silent. Soyeon speaks without emotion. Just facts. Just numbers. Hall listens. And Dan sees something change in his face. Not fear. Hall isn't afraid. Understanding. Hall turns to Dan, asks what he proposes. Dan speaks. The Central Core. Project Noah. 900 meters at the bottom of the ocean. A structure that can hold 20,000, maybe more. To raise it, they need Poseidon's resources. The icebreaker's power. A crew. Equipment. To finish it, they need Dan's expertise. The ARC system. People who believe not in power, but in work. Together, they can raise the core and build it up to Leviathan. Separately, everyone will drown. Everyone. Hall is silent for a long time. A minute. 2. His advisors exchange glances. Then Hall says he needs proof. That the core exists. That Dan's system can be scaled. That the plan is realistic. Dan nods. He expected this. He shows Hall the panel. He's showing it to a stranger for the first time. He activates the interface. Green lines on the wall of the bridge. The ARC's blueprints. Data on the core. Coordinates. Depth. Size. Composition. Energy signature. Hall watches. His meteorologists watch. His engineers, whom he's called into the wardroom, watch. Silence. Hawon sits in the corner and observes every face in the room. She reads their reactions. Poseidon's chief engineer leans forward, interested. The meteorologist has turned pale. He's grasped the scale of it. The security advisor has frowned. He doesn't trust it. Hall doesn't move. He shows no emotion. He's processing it. Then Hall stands up. He walks over to the projection on the wall. He touches the line on the blueprint. Of course, his finger passes right through it. But the gesture speaks louder than words. He is an engineer, and he sees the beauty of the design. Hall turns around, says he'll give an answer in a week, that he'll send his reconnaissance team to the core's coordinates. Hall's answer comes in 5 days, not a week, sooner. His reconnaissance team found the core, confirmed the size, 900 meters, confirmed the depth, 30 meters, confirmed the energy signal, sleep mode, alive, 71 years at the bottom, and it's alive. Hall doesn't come with words. He comes with ships, 3 frigates, 2 transports, and the Leviathan itself, A fleet of 6 vessels lines up next to Ark, one above the core's location. Dan stands on the deck and looks at the gray hulls. Yesterday, they were a threat. Today, they are tools. Hall boards the Ark, alone, unescorted. It's a gesture. He inspects the ship anew, not as a scout, as an engineer. He touches the seams. He taps on the bulkheads. He peeks into the smithy. He stands in the operating room with Jess. He looks at the hydroponics. He listens to the desalinator. Then he turns to Dan and says one sentence. He says he was wrong. Not about everything, but about the main thing. He thought Dan was a dreamer, an idealist, a man who builds beautiful things without understanding the scale. He was wrong. The Ark isn't a dream. It's a working system, rough, imperfect, but alive and scalable. Dan accepts these words. He doesn't thank him. He doesn't celebrate. He nods. Work. Raising the core. An operation on a scale no one in this world has ever seen. 30 meters deep, 900 meters of structure, mass. The panel calculates. 200,000 tons. To lift 200,000 tons from the ocean floor. Dan hasn't slept for 3 days. He's calculating. The panel runs non-stop. Blueprints, diagrams, loads, forces, pressures, cables, pontoons, ballast tanks. Every ton must be accounted for, every cable calculated, every pontoon positioned with meter-level precision. Here's the plan. 200 pontoons made of steel and sealed barrels, each with a lifting capacity of 1,000 tons. Arrange them along the hull. Secure them with cables. Fill the core's ballast chambers with air. Leviathan's compressors will pump in air. The pontoons will provide buoyancy. The core will float. Slowly. Meter by meter. If everything goes according to plan. If the cables hold. If the pontoons don't burst. If the core's hull is intact after 71 years on the seabed. Poseidon's engineers are working with Dan. 5 of them. Good specialists. Trained. Disciplined. But they don't see what Dan sees. They calculate the loads. He sees the system. Every pontoon is connected to every other. Every cable affects the one next to it. If one bursts, the load will redistribute. We need a margin, not 10%, 30%. The Poseidon engineers argue. A 30% margin means extra pontoons, extra time, extra resources. Dan doesn't argue. He shows them. A model on the panel. Failure points are marked in red. If the margin is 10%, there are 23 red points. If 30, 0. The engineers look at the model and fall silent. Soyeon is working in parallel. She's calculating weather windows. How many consecutive days of calm seas are needed for the launch? At least 5. Better yet, 7. According to her data, the window will be in 3 weeks. Then the next one, in 2 months. If they miss the first window, they risk not making it to Leviathan in time. 3 weeks to prepare, 200 pontoons, thousands of meters of rope, compressor lines. Dan is working, the crew is working, Poseidon is working. 300 people from the Ark and Hall's ships. Gross is forging fasteners, day and night. Sparks fly in the darkness. Rom is knotting the slings. His fingers know every knot. Every cable under his hands becomes part of the system. Ashley dives, every day, securing cables to the core's hull, guiding the pontoons. She spends more time underwater than on the surface. Her skin has turned blue from the cold. But she doesn't stop. Soyeon counts. Hae-won coordinates. She has become the link between the Ark and Poseidon. Translating, she mediates. She resolves the conflicts that are inevitable when 200 free-spirited rafters work alongside 100 disciplined soldiers. She does it so quietly and so effectively that both sides think everything is running smoothly on its own. Jess treats. Injuries, cuts, burns, exhaustion. She sleeps almost as little as Dan. Yuna sings on deck in the evenings. Tired people sit and listen. 3 strings and a voice. That's enough to remind them why they're here. On the 16th day, another one arrives. Maya Okafor, 28 years old, mechanical engineer. She didn't come from the raft, from a Poseidon transport. She worked for Hydra Industries, the second corporation. She fled, ended up with Poseidon. heard about the Ark, came. Tall, quiet, hands covered in calluses, wore overalls even during negotiations. She approached Dan and said she knew how to design reactors. That at Hydra, she had designed 3 of the 5 operational power units. That her name wasn't on a single one. Dan looked at her hands, then at her blueprints, which she had brought in a plastic tube. He unfolded them. A reactor module. Clean, elegant, competent. Every line in place, every calculation verified. He said, "Welcome." Maya nodded. She didn't smile. She wasn't used to it. On the 20th day, everything was ready. 203 pontoons, 4,000 meters of cable, 12 compressor lines. Soyeon gives the go-ahead. The weather window has opened. 5 days of calm seas, maybe 6. Enough. Dan gives the command. Not an order, a request. It's time. Leviathan's compressors come to life. A rumble, deep, powerful. Air flows through the hoses to the bottom, fills the core's ballast chambers. The panel shows the pressure. Ton by ton, water is displaced by air. The pontoons pull on the cables. A steel groan echoes across the ocean's surface. The cables tremble, vibrate, sing. The first meter. The core shifts. The seabed releases it with a sucking sound. Silt swirls around. The water turns murky. The second meter. The cables creak. One pontoon heels over. Dan sees a yellow indicator on the panel. He redistributes the load. Green. The third meter. A silhouette rises from the water. Dark, huge, like the shadow of an underwater mountain. People on the decks of the Ark and the Leviathan stand and watch, silently. 5 meters. 10. 20. The core's hull emerges from the depths, slowly, inexorably. A wall of metal, dark gray, covered in seaweed and shells, but intact. Not a single hole, not a single crack. A titanium alloy that lay on the seabed for 71 years and did not give in. The core surfaces on the 3rd day of the operation. 900 meters of steel and titanium lie on the water. The water around it is bubbling. The pontoons are holding. The cables are holding. Everything is holding. Dan stands on the deck of the Ark and watches. His eyes are red from 3 sleepless days. His hands are shaking. His legs won't hold him. Soyeon stands beside him. Her hand touches his elbow. Not to support him, just to touch. He doesn't fall. Dan climbs aboard the core first, alone. The panel activates the core's interface. Lights come on, one by one, along the entire length of the hull. Pale blue, Arc system, central core, status, active, welcome. Inside the core. Halls, corridors, decks, dozens of decks. Workshops, reactor bays, living quarters for thousands of people, medical unit, laboratories, production lines, schools. Everything is mothballed. Everything is operational. Everything has been waiting for 71 years. On the main deck, Dan finds a room, a small one, with a single screen on the wall. The screen comes to life when Dan enters. There is a recording on it, a video recording. A man, about 60 years old, Asian features, a tired face, intelligent eyes, very familiar eyes. The man in the recording speaks. He says his name is Daniel Chen, that he is the chief engineer of Project Noah, that he is recording this on the last day before mothballing, that the core is ready, that the world is not ready, that he has made a decision. Dan stands in front of the screen and looks at his own face, 30 years older, tired, but his own. The man in the recording says that disaster is inevitable, that he tried to warn them, that no one listened, that the core will save thousands, but not millions, that he decided to wait, to mothball the core, to hide the system, and wait until the world breaks down enough to want to be fixed. The recording cuts off. The screen goes dark. Dan stands in the darkness. The panel flickers quietly. So-yeon found him an hour later. He was sitting on the floor in front of the dark screen. She sat down next to him. She didn't ask what he had seen. She just sat there. Dan said he needed time. So-yeon nodded. She said that time was the only thing they didn't have, but she would find some for him. Dan got up. He went out onto the Corps' deck. Outside was the world, the ocean, ships, people. Arc 1 is moored alongside the Corps like a boat at a pier. Hall's Leviathan stands on the other side. Between them lie 900 meters of the future. The display is updating. The Ark, final stage, population, 800 people and growing. The Alliance fleet, 6 Poseidon ships, 18 small vessels. The Tower clans, 3 confirmed alliances, including Pack. The following months pass like one long day. Dan and Maya are working on the core reactor. Maya designs, Dan builds. Her blueprints turn into metal. On every module she designed, Dan engraves her name, etched into the steel. Okafor, main reactor compartment, the Ark. Maya saw it for the first time and stopped. She stood there for a long time, traced the letters with her finger, then turned to Dan. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything, went back to work.
But from that day on, she worked differently. Not just precisely, with a name. Ashley gets her ship. A scout boat. Fast. Light. Dan designed it at night. He took every detail into account. The steering wheel is offset for a left-hander. The seat is high, just the way she likes it. The steering sensitivity is reduced because she hates it when the wheel jerks with every wave. Ashley sat down at the helm. She put her hands on it. She felt it, and she cried. For the first time in 5 years. Silently, just tears running down her cheeks. Then she started the engine and went out on a reconnaissance mission. She returned 3 hours later with a smile. Havon is building a school. Not physically, organizationally. She finds among the Ark's inhabitants those who know how to teach, or at least those who know something worthwhile. An old woman who remembers math. A man who knows how to navigate by the stars. Moon, who can tell you more about the sea than any textbook. Haewon brings them together. She draws up a schedule. She finds a room on the 3rd deck of the Corps. When the school opens and the first 15 children sit down at their desks, one of them raises his hand and says, "Teacher Haewon." She freezes. Teacher Haewon. Not Elder Park's daughter. Not a hostage. Not a diplomat. A teacher. Yuna gets a concert hall. A small one. 100 seats. Dan calculated the acoustics himself. He measured her voice when she sang on deck. He didn't tell her. When Yuna sings in the hall for the first time and hears her voice return to her as a clear echo, she stops in the fullness of the moment. She stands. She listens to the silence after the note. Then she sings again. And the hall full of people listens, and the sound of her voice fills the space that had been waiting for that sound. The Leviathan typhoon arrives earlier than anyone predicted. Even earlier than So-yeon predicted. 2 months early. The Ark is not yet built to its final configuration. 20,000 people are on board, from all corners of the ocean. Rafters, tower dwellers, corporate fugitives, children, the elderly, people who came because they heard there was room. The storm is visible a day in advance, a wall of black clouds stretching from horizon to horizon. The wind grows stronger by the hour. The waves are rising. Dan stands on the Corps' main deck beneath the black sky. Next to him are So-yeon, Ashley, Haewon, Jess, Yuna, Maya, all 6 of them. Behind them, the crew. Behind the crew, 20,000 people. On the decks, in the compartments, on the satellite ships, Hall on the Leviathan in the wake, Pack's turret crews on the tugs, Bravis and his rafters on the decks, Thorn, that very pirate with the scar on the bridge of the small cruiser he built himself in a year. Everyone is here. Everyone has arrived. The panel shows red indicators all over the hull. The reactor is operating at 80%. The unfinished sections of the 6th and 7th decks are vulnerable. 12 modules in the yellow zone, 3 in the red. Dan looks at the indicators. Then he does something he hasn't done once since day 1. He removes the panel. He disables the interface. The green lines fade. The numbers disappear.
For the first time in 2 years, he sees the world without data, just the world. A black sky, white waves, people. He goes on the general channel, the radio channel every ship and every deck can hear. He says he can't design anything else, that it's up to them now. Everyone is responsible for their own module, everyone for their own section. He is responsible for one thing, for having trusted them. Silence on the air. A second, 2. Then Ashley's voice. She says the stern rudder is ready for the storm. Gross's voice. The smithy is secured. Jess's voice. The medbay is ready to receive the wounded. Moon's voice. The bow watch is in position. Rom's voice. The rigging has been checked. Every knot. Haewon's voice. Communication with the towers is stable. Maya's voice. Reactor normal. Soyeon's voice. Course calculated. Hall's voice from the Leviathan. Fleet in formation. Carlos's voice. The children are safe. Inez's voice. A small, quiet voice. The beans are watered. 20,000 people. Everyone in their place. Everyone doing their job. The Ark enters the storm. Not like a ship. Like a city that has decided to live. A wave hits the bow. The Ark groans, but it holds. The wind tears the sails. They are taken down. The engines are running. The reactor hums. Waves come one after another, wall after wall, 10 meters high, 20, 30. The Ark rises onto a wave and crashes down. A blow, the groan of steel, and up again. Ashley at the helm. Her face is calm. Her hands are steady. She steers 900 meters of steel through hell, just as she steered the schooner through the first storm, with feeling, with precision, with faith. The storm lasts 26 hours. 26 hours of darkness and water and wind. People work. They don't sleep. They don't eat. They work. Every leak is patched. Every broken cable is replaced. Every wounded person is brought to Jess. Yuna sings over the shipwide broadcast. 3 a.m, the scariest moment, when it seems like the storm will never end. She sings without words, just a voice in the darkness, and 20,000 people hear her. At 27 hours, the wind dies down, the waves subside, the clouds part, and the first ray of dawn hits the deck of the Ark. Dan stands on the main deck, wet, exhausted, alive. Soyeon is beside him, her hand in his. He doesn't remember when he took hers, or she took his. It doesn't matter. Light floods the deck, golden, warm, real. The Ark is battered. The 6th deck has been breached. 3 small vessels are lost. 17 people are wounded, 2 critically, but not a single death, not a single one. Dan looks toward the horizon and sees them. Sails, dozens, hundreds, from all sides of the horizon. Rafts, motorboats, boats, rowboats. They're heading toward the Ark. Not to attack, to join. People who survived the storm in their little shells and saw the light. Light in the windows in the middle of the black ocean. And they went to it. Soyeon squeezes his hand. Dan squeezes back. The panel lies in his pocket, turned off, unnecessary. Because what he built no longer needs blueprints. It lives on its own. 20,000 people, 900 meters of steel, and dawn.